Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description.
Team 8 by Starcan. What if Naruto had been selected for a different team? What if he'd had a different mentor? Who would guess the consequences would be so large? Adios.
Chapter 11. You want us to test for Chunin? Naruto asked, amazed. He couldn't believe his sensei, who arranged extra training so he could become a respectable genin, actually thought he was now ready to become a Chunin. He looked around their usual training area, wondering if this was a prank of some sort. I am willing to authorize you three to participate in the Chunin exam, Kuranai clarified. Naruto frowned. That was what he just said, wasn't it? I believe Kuranai-sensei is specifying that the choice is ours, Shino explained. Anyo, Hinata said in a hesitant voice, the unexpected news having evidently made her fall back on older, more tentative mannerisms. Isn't it unusual for a team to take the exam during their first year? Kuranai nodded. It is, but I think it would be a valuable training experience for all of you. Also, with the exam being held in Konoha, it should be fairly safe, while still giving you three a chance to see what it is like. That will increase your chances for success at a later date. Naruto frowned a little. You make it sound like we're guaranteed to fail, he objected. Kuranai shook her head. Not quite, but the odds are very low. Keep in mind how rare it is that rookie genin teams are allowed to participate at all. At the same time, teams of any age taking the exam for the second time have a much higher rate of success. You say it's rare for rookie teams to be allowed, Shino observed. Are any of our former classmates to participate? Kuranai nodded. Asuma and Kakashi are giving their teams the option as well. That means Lee and his team will be there as well, Naruto added. There was no way Gai-sensei would let his eternal rivals team trump his. It would be prudent that our first exposure to the exam occur in the company of allies, Shino observed. Naruto grunted. I agree, except that part about us being guaranteed to fail, he said with a scowl. Kuranai took a deep breath. That is merely a matter of statistical fact, Naruto. However, I do expect you three to make a good showing. There is no reason you cannot outperform your classmates, and in fact I expect you to do so, if, after all your hard work, you are shown up by Asuma's genin. I will never hear the end of it, and therefore neither will you. Do I make myself clear? Her voice had gone a little frosty at the end, so Naruto merely nodded and refrained from saying anything else. The group sparring exercises they did together before their mission were particularly grueling, but no one complained. Kuranai allowed herself a small smile as her team quartered the affluent neighborhood Shino's bugs had tracked the cat to this time. It had been too long since she'd been around adolescent males. She'd forgotten how competitive they could be. Their determination to pass the Chunin exam on their first attempt, as rookies, no less, was as laudable as it was impractical. Still, Naruto tended to prove people wrong, especially those who doubted him. Kuranai wondered what kinds of odds Asuma would give her. She shook her head. Such conduct was unbecoming to a Konoha Jonin. At least, betting for money would be. Perhaps a wager of forfeits could be negotiated. Forcing Asuma to give up cigarettes or Kakashi to forego his little orange books for a month could prove to be highly entertaining. Of course, there was also the matter of her forfeits. She was fairly certain that playing to their male egos could let her avoid anything too onerous. At the same time, she was guiltily glad that Iruka was still convalescing from his injuries. If he'd been there when the three of them volunteered their rookie teams, the man was sure to object. Still, she would make a point to break the news to him personally, and explain why she was anxious for her students to make Chunin as quickly as possible. Kuranai shook her head to clear it of such extraneous thoughts as Hinata led her teammates back, carrying the pampered and escape-prone housecat in her arms. Before their meeting, Shino had intercepted his teacher on the way to the team's usual meeting place. He had had a proposal, one she was rather surprised to hear. But it was a good idea, one long in coming. After we returned the cat, Kuranai began as they walked up to Hinata, we will break for the day. Naruto, Hinata, I know you've been working hard pretty much every evening since we returned, but I prefer that you refrain from unsupervised training until the exam starts. Unsurprisingly, Naruto scowled at this. Hinata's reaction, however, was just as visibly dismayed. At least by her standards. Kuranai secretly congratulated herself for nudging those two toward each other, but held up her hand to get their attention. First of all, I don't want you to risk injuring or exhausting yourself when the exam is less than a week away. Secondly, there are many visitors entering Konoha for the exams. Training by yourselves presents a significant risk. I'm not saying you two are incapable of defending yourselves. I'm more worried about a potential competitor spying on you to learn your techniques and tactics. It's unavoidable that you will reveal much during the exams. That is one of the purposes behind having them after all. But I'd rather you didn't give away any more than you have to. Naruto looked thoughtful during this explanation, and finally nodded. Hinata acquiesced as well, though she looked somewhat crestfallen. If that is the case, Shino said, interjecting into the silence that followed. "I would like to extend an invitation to all of you for dinner with my family." Naruto actually jumped a little. Kurenai didn't think he'd actually forgotten his silent teammate was there, but it was rarely enough that he interrupted anyone that it was just as surprising. She also suspected that, deep down, Shino enjoyed twitting his teammate like that. But what Naruto did next was even more distracting. As his teammate's words registered, Naruto's eyes grew very wide. "Are you serious?" he asked in a shocked voice. The naked emotion on the boy's face made Kurenai feel slightly sick. It was a bald reminder of how he'd been treated for so long, a deliberate isolation that made her ill when she allowed her thoughts to dwell upon it. "It was a serious request," Shino replied smoothly. "My parents have expressed a desire to meet with my teammates, and this is a logical social mechanism for facilitating such a gathering." "I would be honored to meet your parents, Shino-kun," Hinata replied gravely, making a short bow. Naruto blinked and then nodded. Yeah, Shino, that would be cool." "Unfortunately," Kurenai said, "I have to attend a meeting the Hokage has called for all the Jonin tonight." While there was a meeting scheduled to go over security arrangements for the upcoming Chunin exam, she could probably beg off if she wanted. But if she attended this gathering, her presence would undoubtedly influence it in many ways. Hinata and Naruto were her subordinates, and would no doubt defer to her when they met with the Abarames, just as they let her do the talking with the Hokage or even with that pig, Daraketsu. That was only proper, and in accord with the respected genin should show for their Jonin sensei. However, it would also prevent the Abarames from meeting the real Hinata and Naruto. The Hyuga girl was repressed enough under normal circumstances, and Naruto had his undeserved reputation working against him. But they were both good kids, and Kurenai felt that people intelligent enough to raise Shino would no doubt see that for themselves, and do so all the better if they were acting normally. Shino nodded gravely. "Given the timing of the exam, this may be the last free night we have for a while, so with your permission we will go ahead with it." Kurenai waved her hand dismissively. "Feel free. Your free time is your own. That goes for all of you," she added. Hinata was surprised and a little anxious about the unexpected invitation. Of course, she'd attended innumerable clan functions as a member of the Hyuga main family, but crib sounded a lot more informal than that. She had some formal kimonos she could wear, but she thought those might be too dressy. As Kurenai left for her meeting and Shino went ahead to bring word of their acceptance to his parents, Hinata's eyes flickered over toward Naruto. It was then that several pieces slid into place for her. No, she wouldn't wear a kimono. She knew from their camping trip that Naruto didn't have many clothes aside from his uniforms and a few t-shirts and pairs of shorts. Certainly nothing dressy. And he didn't have time to purchase something before the dinner. She would sooner take poison than embarrass her friend by dressing up and making him appear shabby by comparison. She was also heartened to know that Shino had been as good as his word. This invitation was proof that he was making headway with his clan regarding Naruto-kun. Given the reactions she'd seen on the street, she doubted anyone would willingly invite Uzumaki Naruto into their home without strong persuasion. She was jolted out of her reverie when the subject of her thoughts hesitantly tugged on her sleeve. Hinata?" Naruto asked, hesitantly. "Why yes, Naruto," she answered, damning herself for the quaver that still showed up at times. She was much more comfortable talking to him than she ever thought she would be, but sometimes he would catch her off balance and her old habits would reassert themselves. Well, you see," he began, but let his voice trail off. "What am I supposed to do?" he finally asked, his frustration clearly overriding his nervousness. "Do?" Hinata asked, confused. "About this dinner thing," he added. "Am I supposed to bring something? How do I dress? What am I supposed to say?" Hinata blinked and quickly bit her lip. Of course Uzumaki Naruto had never been invited for dinner at someone's house before. He had no idea what to do, and it clearly distressed him. Hinata surmised that Naruto realized what a break from custom Shino's invitation represented and didn't want to waste it. Without thinking, she let her free hand rest on his wrist in a comforting gesture. "I understand, Naruto-kun. I think this is mostly going to be an informal affair. Shino just invited us today, so probably no special preparation is expected. Our uniforms are still clean, and will be appropriate if they remain so." Her wardrobe suspicions were confirmed when Naruto let out a relieved sigh. His eyes flickered down to her hand on his and Hinata quickly withdrew hers with a rosy blush. But he didn't tease her about it. "Thanks, Hinata-chan," he said sincerely. "I guess you know more about this kind of stuff, huh?" She nodded. "I had a lot of lessons on etiquette and protocols from father, as well as the kunoichi lectures." Naruto's eyes darkened when she mentioned her father, but she had no idea how to ask him about that without seeming to pry. "Well, I'll just watch you a lot then," he said with an impudent grin. The idea of Naruto-kun watching her, taking cues from her actions, was enough to set the blood to flooding her cheeks again. Naruto shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other as Hinata pressed a lacquered tile set into the doorframe. Faint chimes could be heard through the door. Shino's parents lived with the other Abarames in a neighborhood informally known as the Hive, to the rest of Konoha. Given their hobbies, it seemed that other people were reluctant to live in close proximity, Shino had observed as he gave them directions. But that made it easier for them to buy up all the adjoining real estate. Naruto had thought about that as his teammate departed to let his parents know how many were coming for dinner. He had personal experience with how intolerant some people could be. It made him feel just a little better that it wasn't only him that suffered for it. He snuck a glance at his teammate as she clasped her hands in front of her stomach in a nervous gesture. Being in a prestigious family didn't guarantee you'd be treated well either. He suppressed the surge of resentment that always accompanied such thoughts these days. This wasn't the time for it. The door opened and what seemed to be a larger version of Shino stood in the doorway. As Naruto hoped, Hinata took the lead. "We are honored to be invited to your home, Aburame-sama," she said, deliberately using the more deferential, polite form as they both bowed deeply. Shino's father politely inclined his head. "You may call me Shibi," he said gravely. "That is an unusual method of address, coming from a Hyuga," he observed as he moved aside to allow them entry. Hinata's cheeks colored, and Naruto didn't have to be reminded how the Hyugas were considered first among Konoha's ninja clans. Her father's arrogance during their last mission had made an indelible impression on his mind. And it made Hinata's humility and politeness all the more noteworthy, even if such attention flustered her. "Well, you're still Shino's dad," Naruto said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Like his son, Shibi wore dark glasses, even inside his own home, so his eyes were unreadable as they gazed at Naruto for a moment. He nodded slightly, as if in acknowledgement, and then led them toward a sitting room where he informed them that his wife and son were waiting. At this point, Naruto was expecting Shino's mother to be much like her husband and son, except perhaps with a slightly more feminine jacket. He could not have been more wrong. The lady of the house wore an emerald green tunic over long pants. The former had an exotic cut to it and the color matched her eyes perfectly. The fact that her eyes were visible was a shock of its own, but her behavior was even more so. "You must be Naruto and Hinata," she said, rising from her seat with a large smile. "Welcome to our home." They began to bow, Naruto watching Hinata from the corner of his eye to make sure he went far enough, but she waved them off. "No need for that, this isn't a meeting of the clan elders, otherwise Shino would be bullying people and making them feel stupid. We just want to get to know our son's friends. I'm Misato, and I see you met Shibi-kun already." Both the Aburame males looked chagrined at different points in her speech. Naruto looked up and locked gazes with the cheerful woman. She didn't hesitate, or refuse to meet his eyes. Naruto saw curiosity and good-natured teasing in abundance, but no fear. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. He hadn't intended to voice the question out loud, and the sound of his own voice startled him just a bit. "Not a bit," she said. "I met my husband when he was the official envoy to Hidden Mist." She smiled over at her husband. "He was so serious and solemn that I never stood a chance. His assignment ended right after Shino was born and all three of us returned to Konoha." Naruto looked over at Shino with raised eyebrows. He never knew Shino hadn't been born in Konoha. Not that it really made a difference, but it underlined how little he really knew about his friend. "Anyway," Misato concluded, "that's why I'm a little livelier than these two." She cracked a teasing grin as Shino and Shibi both raised visible eyebrows above their glasses. "I had such hopes for Shino, too. He was such a pretty baby, always laughing and so ticklish." Her eyes took on a wicked glint as she exercised her parental prerogative to embarrass her child in front of his peers. "Anyo," Hinata interjected. "Shino is very lively," she continued, defending her friend. "He's just, quiet." "Yeah," Naruto added quickly. "He makes up for me being so loud." Shino let out an audible sigh from behind his jacket collar. "Shino," Misato said in a tragic voice, her eyes dancing with mischief. "This is the first time you brought friends home. I have a lot of time to make up for." "Perhaps," Shibi countered, "we can continue this discussion over dinner, as that was the reason our guests were invited." "Very well," Misato agreed and started leading them toward an archway. "The roasted termites are probably about done, but th for long." Naruto paused for a moment as his brain struggled with some disconcerting mental images. He swallowed heavily and silently renewed his vow to do nothing that would spoil the evening. "She has an unusual sense of humor," Shino muttered quietly as he fell into step next to him. "I heard that," Misato said as she entered the dining room. "And good hearing, too," Naruto commented. "Ooh." Fortunately for Hinata, the dinner was fairly normal fare for Konoha, although prepared with obvious precision. She'd had to eat some unusual things at formal dinners, but she wasn't sure she could eat roasted bugs without some time to prepare herself. Shino's mother was not what she'd expected, especially after meeting his father on the border patrol mission. But while Misato had definitely caught them off balance, she was still quite nice, in addition to being a good cook. Her sense of humor reminded Hinata of Naruto at his pranking best, teasing and playful, but never deliberately cruel. The conversation over the dinner table was somewhat more serious, as Shino's parents set to learning more about their son's comrades. However, Misato had obvious difficulty keeping a straight face once Naruto confirmed that the rumors about Maida Guy were fairly accurate. Naruto's imitation of his taijutsu tutors, power of youth, Rad was uncannily accurate. It also left Misato looking like she was about to injure herself or at least collapse due to lack of air. They seemed a bit surprised at the training regimen that she and Naruto adhered to. Objectively, she knew that many kunoichi her age desired more free time to be with friends and family or just to have fun. But her shyness meant she had few friends, even if father would have allowed her to make friends outside the clan. Shameful as it was to admit, the less time she spent around her family, the better she seemed to feel. Training with Naruto and going on missions with her team was, in fact, about the most enjoyable thing she could think of to do. Hinata was seized with a vague sense of wrongness when she thought about how different her life seemed to be, compared to other genin. But dwelling on that didn't seem to be a good idea. Getting stronger, helping Naruto and Shino become stronger, those were good things. Productive things. Things she could actually make a difference in. When they finished their recital of A Day in the Life of Team 8, Shino's parents exchanged a look. Your assessment of the relative deficits was accurate, Aburame Shibi said, turning toward Shino. While I do not, at this time, believe you are a liability, that may change soon. You will now spend the mornings working with your mother on her weapons specialty. Hinata wasn't sure what that referred to, but given the speed at which Shino turned toward Aburame Misato, it seemed to be important. The woman shrugged and gave a lazy grin that was almost a smirk. I promised my teacher I wouldn't pass anything along to someone not of the village, but technically, you were born there. Shino nodded slowly. I see. He turned back toward his father. And the breeding project? It will continue, Shibi confirmed. But as your uncle Bataru's replacement, I can assign one of the other clan members to take charge of the maintenance. It is, after all, a project that will benefit the clan as a whole if it is successful. Project? Naruto asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. Shino took a deep breath, but paused and looked at his friend. He shook his head briefly. Faster bugs, was all he said. Really? Naruto asked. Cool. So are you looking forward to the Chunin exam? Misato asked, obviously steering the conversation onto safer ground. Hinata couldn't help a small smile as Naruto talked about the exam, his natural enthusiasm eroding any lingering awkwardness. Thought she did wish he hadn't included her when he stated that Team 8 would kick everyone's butt and all make Chunin. You do remember our sensei stating the odds of rookie genin passing the test? Shino asked in a slightly acid tone. Never tell me the odds, Naruto said firmly. Besides, he added, we have Hinata-chan on our side. Right, Hinata-chan? Hyuga Hinata promptly wished she knew a Doden jutsu she could use to sink through the floor. Her face grew redder as Naruto unabashedly boasted of her finishing off the shinobi that broke into the Hokage's tower, and how she pierced the kidnapper's genjutsu and rescued her sister with spectacular acrobatics. Oddly enough, when Misato asked Naruto what he'd done in those fights, he just shrugged and said, I hit them a few times. He paused. Well, more than a few times if you count the cage bunchin. While Misato seemed to lead the questioning, Shino's father just listened quietly for the most part. But Shibi's attention still felt like a physical weight when he was focused upon you. Hinata was slightly uncomfortable with how that reminded her of her father in some respects, but his gaze seemed to lack the anger that always simmered in her father's eyes. Of course, dealing with years of failures on her part had to have a lot to do with that, she realized. The time passed with surprising speed, and before they knew it dinner was over and they were lingering over one last cup of tea with the Aburames. Thank you for inviting us into your home, Hinata said in a formal tone as the evening seemed to be winding down. Naruto nodded his agreement and Hinata had to suppress a blush. It was odd to finally encounter a situation where Naruto had to rely on her so heavily. It felt good. For once, she had an opportunity to guide him after all the times he'd helped her or inspired her. Even beyond that, she found that without the nervousness inspired by her father's assessing gaze, she'd actually enjoyed taking a meal with strangers and getting to know them. It was also refreshing to go an entire meal without slipping up, forgetting what to say, or otherwise embarrassing herself. Perhaps it was because Naruto needed her knowledge to guide them both, but she was pretty sure it was something else. The pleasure was all ours, Misato said with an impish grin. Shino's mother was so unlike her husband or son, but Hinata intuited that they actually enjoyed the differences between them. Having been raised under the strict Hyuga protocols for proper behavior, both in public and in private, it was a startling concept for Hinata to digest. Startling, but strangely attractive nonetheless. Agreed, Aburame Shibi added. You both are welcome in our house at any time. Hinata, not trusting her voice at the moment, merely bowed deeply. Out of the corner of her eye, she was relieved to see Naruto aping her, despite the confused look on his face. The declaration by Shino's father was the highest compliment that could be paid to a guest, and amounted to an offer of alliance and even temporary sanctuary, if needed. That is not necessary, Shibi said, though his tone was not sharp. Shino's assessment of your nature and characters logically requires this. Even beyond that, if his teammates were not capable, brave, and loyal, our son might not have survived his first C-rank mission. Shino did his part too, Naruto said as he straightened up, scowling. Yes, he did. Shibi agreed. But if you two had not done yours as well, the mission could have ended in failure, or even death. Your success is integral to his success. That is the nature of a team. Even beyond that, there is the matter of the prisoner that you protect us from. Hinata bit her lip as Naruto froze in place at the mention of the Kyuubi. Everyone here is aware of your burden, Uzumaki Naruto, so I am not breaking the Hokage's law, Shino's father continued. That said, we are guilty of relying on hearsay as to your previous actions and character. That situation has since been corrected, he added, giving Shino a sideways glance. But I would still like to extend an apology, on behalf of my family and my clan. Hinata could almost feel the jumble of emotions coming from Naruto as his face ducked his head forward, his eyes having grown suspiciously shiny. Apologies are not necessary, he said quickly in a thick voice. As you say, Uzumaki-san, Shibi replied. But you will not be slandered without cause within my hearing. Hinata looked up from Naruto and ended up locking gazes with Misato. The woman's bright green eyes seemed to bore into hers for a moment. Then she gave the pale-eyed girl a slow, deliberate wink. For what, Hinata wasn't sure. Naruto was still a bit numb as they made their goodbyes and left the Aburame neighborhood. Objectively, he'd hoped to win over the people of Konoha when he became Hokage, hoped they would acknowledge him and the burden he'd carried for them since the day of his birth. But to have it actually happen, was not something he was prepared for. The Aburame were not the largest or most prestigious of Konoha's shinobi clans. But to have even one family break ranks from the rest and declare him welcome into their home at any time, he didn't need Hinata's whispered explanation as they walked along the moonlit streets of Konoha to know how significant that was. And he was far too excited to be calmly walking down the street. With a grin he grabbed Hinata's hand and leapt onto the nearest roof. His sparring partner's reflexes were as fast as his and she managed to time her leap to meet his own. With the moon, it was as bright as noon to their dark adjusted eyes. With a playful grin, Naruto let go of Hinata's hand and tapped her shoulder with his fingertips. You're it, he said as he sprang away. In an instant, Hinata was pursuing him across the rooftops. Fortunately, they'd both increased their weights recently, so they were fairly evenly matched as they darted from roof to roof. Given their normal training regimen, they were used to far more physical activity than they'd had that day. Aside from that, Naruto had never had the chance to play games like this before, and playing tag with your own shadow clones was just pathetic. At one point he landed near an odd-shaped roof cornice that shimmered and melted away to reveal a figure wearing an anbu mask. Pursuit training, Naruto said quickly as he leapt away. Excuse me Anbu-san. Naruto smiled as he heard Hinata's voice echo from the roof he'd just vacated. Their game meandered across the rooftops of Konoha until they cut across a block of buildings usually reserved for visiting officials. As he landed, Naruto was engulfed in a miasma of killing intent more intense than he'd ever felt. Instead of leaping away, he dropped into a crouch and spun, seeking the source of the murderous rage. There, standing on the roof beam was a smallish red-headed shinobi with a large gourd strapped to his back. Teal-colored eyes, ringed with dark circles, glared at him with frightening intensity. Above one eye was a kanji symbol obscured by hair and shadows. The sash securing the gourd in place held a hidden sand symbol that glinted in the moonlight. Fighting Kazuya to the death wasn't nearly as frightening as having this strange kid just look at him. Naruto clenched his fists to keep his hands from shaking. His feet felt rooted in place. If this strange kid attacked, would he even be able to dodge? Just then, Hinata landed next to him and let out a quiet gasp. Without thinking, Naruto found himself moving, standing in front of his frozen teammate, facing the terrifying shinobi with a kunai in each hand. He could feel the red chakra pulsing in his coils now, raging like a living thing, wanting out. His eyes, suddenly seeing with incredible clarity, picked out the small wisps of sand circling around the boy's feet. His nose picked up the smell of old blood. Was it coming from the sand or from the gourd? And how was he smelling it from here? It wasn't until Naruto noticed the faint red glare reflecting back from the dulled tiles around him that the boy spoke. You're like me, he said in a voice as quiet as the grave. Who are you and what are you doing here? Naruto asked, his voice coming out calmer than he felt. I am Sabaku no Gaara, the boy answered, again in that dry whisper. I am here to participate in the Chunin exam. Hinata edged to his left. Out of the corner of his eye, Naruto could see her Byakugan activated. He resisted the urge to move between her and the sand shinobi again. But when Gaara's eyes moved toward her, Naruto spoke up to keep the attention focused on him. Maybe I'll see you in the exam then, he said in a mocking voice. Gaara nodded, either missing or ignoring the sarcasm. I didn't know Konoha had created its own weapon. You and I will fight, in this exam. And then I will kill you. Gaara smiled then, and Naruto had to revise his most terrifying experience list again. Those teal-colored eyes held no hint of sanity. Maybe, maybe not, Naruto said lightly. But in the meantime, I need to escort the lady home. Enjoy the moonlight. With that, he turned toward his teammate, making finger signs with his left hand the moment it was concealed by his body. Hinata nodded and leapt away, Naruto following close behind her. He wasn't comfortable turning his back on this Gaara, who, whatever he was, even if they were fairly far away. But the boy didn't seem ready to fight just yet, so Naruto kept his own tone as casual as possible. It seemed to work because they landed on the next roof unmolested. Let's get you home, Naruto said urgently. Kurenai-sensei was right. With all these strangers in Konoha, this isn't a good idea. Hinata didn't look happy about it, but she nodded in agreement. Kurenai was a little exasperated to hear of her students' late-night encounter with the foreign shinobi. She'd asked them to avoid late-night training just to prevent such an encounter, but it was also gratifying that they didn't hesitate to reveal their disobedience. But to end up in a life-threatening situation over a game of tag. She looked at them again, taking in the uncomfortable postures, Naruto's scowl, and Hinata's nervous fingers, and suppressed a sigh. Sometimes it was easy to forget that they were still kids in some ways. A genin was mostly an adult, at least in the eyes of the village, but the trappings of childhood were not so easily shed. And in these two cases, she was sure neither of them had experienced much of a childhood in the first place. And a late-night game of tag, conducted with sufficient stealth to apparently startle an anbu, was hardly defiance of her orders. They'd merely had the bad luck to encounter an unusually frightening competitor on that rooftop. Thank you for telling me this, Kurenai said. In the future, you should probably not wander around after dark. Especially if there is a chance that this Gaara person may seek you out. I'll see what I can find out about him. Naruto nodded, but the troubled look on his face persisted. He said that I was like him, he said in a quiet voice, and that he didn't know that Konoha had created its own weapon. Kurenai stared at her student. There were possibilities implied in those words, possibilities too awful to speculate about. Anyo, Hinata interjected, flinching slightly when they both turned toward her. And Naruto, when I looked at him with the Byakugan, there was some gold-colored chakra mixed in with his. Like me, Naruto echoed. He has a demon, like me? Kurenai nodded, her mind now racing at the possibilities. She had no idea how powerful it might be, but this was something the Hokage needed to know immediately. Hardly like you in most respects, Shino objected. You do not display an excessive amount of bloodlust, nor are you given toward idle threats. He paused. This Gaara also seems to demonstrate a certain economy with his words that you lack. Naruto blinked. So he speaks better than I do. Thanks a lot, Shino. He smiled at his impassive teammate. But Hinata still appeared troubled. And you don't see yourself as a weapon, Naruto-kun, but that's what he called himself, she said, her brows stitched with anguish. That's right, Naruto agreed, frowning. We trailed off as she stared into space. She swallowed. What would it be like, Naruto-kun, if you had no one like us, like Iruka-sensei, like the Hokage-sama? What if everyone hated and feared you, and no one accepted you? Kurenai's mind, augmented by her studies of the human mind for advanced genjutsu, came to a conclusion first. But she held her tongue to see if the others would figure it out on their own. Surprisingly, Naruto answered first. I think I'd probably hate them back. Do you think that's what happened to him? Hinata nodded slowly. However, Shino interjected, that does not make him less dangerous. I agree, Kurenai added. I would suggest that you avoid him at all costs during the exam. I need to go speak to the Hokage, so you are released from your duties today. I think this constitutes an even stronger reason to avoid being outside for long after dark. Do you think it will be alright to train within our homes? Hinata asked quickly. Kurenai nodded. I think that will be fine. Tomorrow we will go over some things that might help you on the exam. I take it all three of you are still interested in taking it? After they nodded, Kurenai dismissed them and made her way to the Hokage's tower at a rather quick walk. Anything more would have drawn potentially hostile attention. Ooh, this kind of sucks, Naruto muttered as they walked toward Moritaki's. He'd pressed for ramen, but been outvoted. We've eaten at Ichiraku's 4 times in the past 2 weeks, Shino observed, with just a hint of tolerant amusement. I don't mean where we're going for lunch, Naruto snapped irritably. I mean us having to cut back our training. It was like Shino didn't think he was capable of worrying about something besides ramen. Wonderful, hot, savory ramen. It will not heavily impact my new training regimen, Shino observed. Out of the corner of his eye, Naruto noticed him rolling his shoulders slightly. Didn't Misato say something about weapons training? Yeah, but that's just because you can train at home, Naruto countered, rolling his eyes. Anyo, Hinata stammered. See, could we not train at your apartment? She asked. Naruto paused as he struggled to absorb the idea. It's not very big, he objected. We can still work on chakra control, Hinata insisted. Perhaps some light sparring, she continued. We won't really have much room to maneuver, Naruto said with an embarrassed catch in his voice. His apartment was nothing to brag about. Sometimes combat occurs in close quarters, Shino countered, so it might be useful to practice in such a setting. My new instructor has me practice my forms in our basement, which is filled with incubation equipment. Naruto nodded slowly, but was even more convinced by the obvious relief Hinata was displaying. She was actually pretty good at hiding things when she tried, but he was slowly getting better at reading her. He didn't have to be a genius shinobi to realize that she'd rather train than be around her family, so even cramped quarters at his place would be preferable. He just had to make sure he cleaned up and didn't leave any dirty underwear on the floor. Kuranai sighed as she left the Hokage's office. He'd been highly concerned when she reported Naruto's encounter with the Tsunoboy, Gaara. But it wasn't like they could summarily dismiss him from the exam, not without a serious explanation. He was the youngest son of the case cage, which only complicated things. Even if Suna was a nominal ally of Konoha, their entering the demon host, especially one as bloodthirsty as this Gaara seemed to be, would be like dumping a piranha in a goldfish bowl. But if they objected to his presence, they'd have to explain how they knew, and Gaara's words only made sense if one knew that Naruto was a jinchuriki as well. Barring one without barring both of them would be seen as the worst kind of favoritism, and the Hokage was not willing to reveal Naruto's secret to the leaders of the other delegations. There were already rumors of the shadowy Akatsuki organization taking an interest in Konoha, and there was nothing to be gained by adding fuel to that fire. But they would be on their guard at least. Team 8 had fulfilled its primary function as a recon team, finding out important information and reporting it to the Hokage. Using that information correctly was their leader's responsibility. She only hoped he made the right decision. The day of the exam dawned with typical Konoha weather, bright sunshine and a hint of coolness on the breeze. Weather that made Naruto want to stay outside all day and half the night. He met Shino and Hinata at their training ground in a frame of mind that was not really conducive to taking a long test. He'd been bouncing on the balls of his feet, bursting with nervous tension since he left his apartment. This was it, really, the first step on his path to becoming Hokage and making everyone acknowledge him. How could he possibly remain calm? Everything was changing, even his morning training sessions with Guy, Lee, and Hinata. The last couple of days, instead of pounding each other into the dirt, they did light warm-ups, advanced forms, and attended an informal seminar on battlefield tactics. The latter showed Naruto something he was only beginning to understand. Maida Guy was a lot smarter than his wardrobe or haircut suggested. Outside of his enthusiasms, the Jonin could be just as ruthless as a mission called for, and since he focused on taijutsu, he'd given a lot of thought on how to handle multiple opponents, how to deal with long-range attacks, and how to neutralize an enemy's advantages. Naruto was a little uncomfortable with the thought that Guy-sensei might be helping them beat his own team, if the Chunin examination included head-to-head competition. He knew that Tenten was getting some special genjutsu training from Kuranai, but he still realized that Guy was going far beyond the original bargain. It wasn't until the end of the last session that Guy became very serious, and Naruto came to understand his reasoning. "Tomorrow you will be entering the Chunin examination," he said as they sprawled on the grass after performing what he called simple cool-down exercises, which most people would probably consider to be an entire workout on their own. "While you three will be better prepared than many genin, and your power of youth will shine very brightly for all to see." Guy stopped and visibly restrained himself from going off on that all-too-familiar tangent. "Keep in mind that the examination itself can be very dangerous. Do not underestimate your opponents, but more importantly, do not forget who your friends are." He paused, seeming to take in their curious looks. "Even though the exam is being held here in Konoha, there will be many participants from other villages. Some of them may not hold very honorable intentions, and may seek to harm or kill another competitor to give them an edge. Although not encouraged, this is not strictly against the rules the hidden villages all agreed to." Guy drew those incredibly thick eyebrows down into a fair approximation of a frown. "Please watch out for your fellow shinobi during the exam. Even the strongest rivalry should be put away when facing shinobi from another village. That is one of the Leaf's greatest strengths. If we forget that, then we have truly turned our backs on the power of youth." That's when it really struck Naruto. Guy wanted them all to pass, everyone from Konoha. And if they helped each other as he asked, then that would improve the chances for Neji, Tenten, and Lee as well. Naruto, stunned by this unexpected complexity, just nodded vigorously. Guy gave him one of those blinding smiles that made Naruto want to go buy toothpaste. Still, such sobering thoughts couldn't compete with Naruto's competitive nature, so he was wound as tight as a spring when he met his teammates. Of course, if Shino had any concerns about the exam, he wasn't showing any of it. Sometimes the Aburame boys' calm deliberation was the entire Konohamaru Corps on a sugar high. For an instant, Naruto wondered if he realized that and just did it on purpose. No, not possible, he decided as he turned toward Hinata, who just entered the clearing as well. For once, she was able to meet his eyes without looking away. She was standing a little straighter than usual as well. Naruto softly exhaled the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She was so calm and centered that he couldn't help but absorb some of that himself. For some reason, just her presence seemed to relieve his nervous agitation. The chakra control exercises she'd led him through definitely benefited from that. Even the pesky red chakra seemed to behave itself better under her watchful eye. Naruto had lost count of how many times he'd cast the water jutsu into his sink, but bit by bit his control had improved. He was able to further reduce the amount of chakra he molded into the technique, while reducing the amount of time it took to complete the seals. Of course, his progress was nowhere near even. The first time he'd made a breakthrough, his elation caused the jutsu to spiral out of control, spraying water across his small kitchen. Interestingly enough, when this happened, Hinata threw up her hands in reflex and the spray of water seemed to split and mostly flow around her instead of soaking her jacket. "Are we ready to go?" Hinata asked softly, jolting Naruto out of his reverie. He nodded, hoping he hadn't been staring at her or something weird. He stayed quiet as they walked toward their destination. Kurenai-sensei said that all the Jonin had been drafted to help with the exam, but that she hoped to see them in the later stages. As they entered the building where the exam was being held, Naruto felt uncomfortable, almost like someone was watching him. His suspicions were borne out as they climbed the stairs and Hinata whispered, "Genjutsu," in a voice that barely carried as far as her teammates' ears. As they approached room 301, or what looked like it anyway, there was a crowd of younger shinobi gathered outside the door. Two rough-looking older genin had just finished knocking Lee and Tenten back as Team 7 objected. "We're doing you kids a favor, keeping you out," one of the older genin said. "None of you look like you can handle us, let alone a test that makes some people forever give up being a shinobi, or just kills them." "That's a sound argument," Sasuke said in a challenging voice, "but I will pass and undo this field you've created using an illusionary technique. I want to go to the third floor." Naruto noted the small smile on Tenten's lips as they walked up to the altercation. Evidently she'd spotted it as well. He began concentrating chakra in his center. Something was a little fishy about those genin. Sasuke and the unnamed genin started to exchange kicks when Lee appeared between them in a flash of green, grabbing their legs while the kicks were still chambered. For a stunned moment, both Sasuke and the genin were held in place until Lee released their legs and they had to back off to retain their balance. Naruto released the chakra pulse while everyone's attention was focused on the aborted fight. He frowned. He barely pushed anything into it, and the pulse still washed across the hallway and probably enveloped the whole building. Still, it did what it was supposed to do. The two suspicious genin were revealed as adult chunin in the gray uniforms of examination proctors. Neji, who was starting to rebuke Lee for showing off, turned and glared at Naruto before turning back to his teammate. Naruto gave him a jaunty wave, guessing he'd figured out where the pulse had come from. Too bad his Byakugan hadn't been on, so it could have blinded him for a bit. Hinata's cousin was way too arrogant for his own good. "Evidently the exam actually began the moment we entered the building," Shino observed. "And we should expect other parts to not be as they seem," Hinata added. Naruto grunted and nodded, but his attention was more focused on Rock Lee. His cheeks were bright red as he asked Sakura out on a date. She turned him down, of course, glancing sidelong at Sasuke as if to see whether he was jealous of the attention paid to her. Naruto noted with a sinking stomach that it only seemed to fire up Lee's determination. He saw Lee speak briefly with his teammates as the crowd split up, now ignoring the amused chunin, one of which was openly smirking at Naruto. When Lee followed after Team 7, Naruto knew he had to do something. "I'll meet you on the third floor," he said quickly as he took off after Lee. Fortunately, he managed to catch his friend right after he challenged Sasuke to a fight. "Excuse us," he said as he dragged Lee around the corner and down the hall out of sight of Team 7. "Naruto," Lee said, struggling to remove his elbow from Naruto's grasp. "Why are you interfering?" "Lee, have you forgotten what Gai-sensei said?" Naruto snapped. Those were words he never thought he'd say. Lee flinched like he had been struck a heavy blow. "The test has begun," Naruto said quietly. "They're still Konoha shinobi, even if Sasuke is a jerk. We don't fight allies. Not in this kind of situation." Lee looked down. Naruto thought he looked unusually subdued. "After the exam, I will run 200. "Lee," Naruto said quickly, "why did you want to fight Sasuke so badly?" Lee didn't say anything, but let out a heartbroken sigh. Naruto massaged his forehead with his free hand. "Sakura." He wanted to impress Sakura. "Lee, we're friends, right? Friends and eternal rivals, like Gai-sensei and that terribly cool and hip Kakashi." I thought Neji was your rival. He is too cold, Naruto-san. I want a rival that burns with the fires of youth as hotly as I do." "Ah. Right. Okay, well, even as a rival. Well, you know, Lee, some things transcend rivalry." "What do you mean?" "I mean being a guy, Lee. We're both guys, right?" "Yosh, right. So, as one guy to another, I had to warn you about Sakura. I used to like her a lot, before I got to know her. Sakura isn't as nice as she seems. She only likes one person and she doesn't really give a damn about anyone else. I don't want to see you waste your time on her like I did. She just isn't worth it." "Oh, Naruto, you sound so bitter." Surely the power of youth has not left you forlorn? One of these days that stuff's going to make sense to me, and then I'll know I'm in trouble. Look Lee, as your friend, as your rival, I'd rather see you pursue someone nicer than that. Take my advice or not, but if you don't you'll come to regret it. I will think about what you have said, Naruto-san, but I find it troubling. She is so beautiful, I know, me too. Lee looked down at his elbow and Naruto released it with a sheepish grin. We better get going before our teams kill us for making them late, the short-statured blonde said. Neither shinobi noticed the pink-haired girl leaning against the wall around the corner from where they'd held their discussion. Her bright green eyes were clouded over and her face held an expression of chagrin. Even her inner self was decidedly subdued. Neither boy had said anything that inner Sakura could really get angry about. Naruto thought she was beautiful, but wasn't very nice, and he was concerned that if Rock Lee pursued her, then he would be hurt as well. This coming from the boy who'd always pestered her for dates while they were at the academy. But that had stopped the day they were assigned to their teams. Belatedly, she began to wonder if she'd hurt him with her constant rejections. It wasn't all her fault though. It's not like she was obligated to go out with him just because he asked. And she didn't want to spoil her chances with Sasuke-kun. Unbidden, memories of some of her more forceful rejections came to mind, burning away a lot of her self-justifications. I'm not a very nice person, she whispered to herself. Her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the empty hallway. After taking a short, Yuto and Lee caught up to their respective teams right outside the examination room. Surprisingly, Kurenai-sensei and Gai-sensei were there as well. I'm glad you decided to join us, the red-eyed Jonin said in a slightly sarcastic manner. Sorry, Naruto said. I needed to talk to Lee about something. Kurenai raised an eyebrow. I hope it was important, because you two have kept both teams waiting. Naruto glanced at Lee out of the corner of his eye. The green-clad Genin's eyes were locked onto his teacher, who was standing slightly behind Kurenai, giving them a discreet thumbs up. It kind of was, he said slowly, hoping Kurenai didn't immediately press him for details. She'd seemed a little extra irritable lately. It better, since your teammates cannot enter without you, she replied dryly. What if not all of us wish to enter the exam? Shino asked. Genin can only enter the exam as an entire team, Kurenai clarified. But then why did you tell us? Naruto started to ask, but his voice trailed off as he put the pieces together. You wanted to make sure all three of us really wanted to test, it wasn't a question. Kurenai nodded, smiling slightly. Very good, Naruto, she congratulated him. His sensei didn't go into wild histrionics like Guy, but her simple words of approval warmed Naruto, almost making him blush. Team 8 stood politely aside while Guy ushered his team into the exam room. Naruto made a point of ignoring Hyuga Neji and the cold glares he shot at them. He didn't know if it was Hinata, or if the boys somehow held him responsible for Lee's drunken rampage. Naruto was completely innocent of that fiasco. However, he had to admit that if he'd known Lee would beat the snot out of the arrogant Hyuga when liquored up, he'd have made sure it happened. Frequently, I want you three to be careful in there, Kurenai said in a voice little more than a whisper. For political reasons, we can't exclude this Gaara person from the exam. So I want you three to avoid him at all costs, is that understood? Naruto nodded along with the rest, but privately he wasn't sure Gaara would cooperate. The odd boy seemed almost indecently focused on Naruto after he realized Naruto's secret. Then good luck, she whispered as she opened the door for them. Objectively, Naruto realized that there would be a lot of participants in the Chunin exam. Subjectively, he wasn't completely prepared to have almost 100 pairs of unfriendly eyes lock onto him the moment he stepped into the testing room. Naruto found his feet moving without thought, placing himself between his team and the potential hostiles, while his fists clenched and his face twisted into a ferocious scowl. The closest genin immediately backed up a couple of steps and Naruto wondered if they were jockeying for room in which to attack. Don't even think about it, he snapped, a muscle along his jaw jumping with nervous tension. Oi, Naruto, stop making a scene. It's far too troublesome, a bored-sounding voice snapped him out of his focus. Naruto eased back out of the combat stance he dropped into and turned toward the familiar-sounding voice. Clumped together beside the door were the members of Team 7, Team 10, and Team Guy, who just preceded them into the room. Shikamaru was leaning against the wall while Choji stood next to him working on a bag of chips. Ino was talking to Sakura, and they weren't arguing for once. In fact, Sakura seemed oddly subdued. On the other hand, Kiba was talking to Akamaru, who seemed oddly agitated. Sasuke and Neji were both giving him strange looks as well. Tenten seemed to be whispering a question to Neji, but wasn't getting an answer. At least Lee seemed somewhat normal for him anyway, and wasn't visibly pursuing Sakura, to Naruto's relief. Cautiously, Team 8 went to stand with the other rookies. Technically Team Guy wasn't a rookie squad, but they were only a year older. The older genin seemed to resent our presence, Shino observed. Well, duh, Kiba said, placing the rather nervous-looking dog back on top of his hood. If you had to wait 3 or 4 years before your sensei let you take the Chunin exam, people like us make you look bad. Shino paused, seeming to stare at the Inuzuka boy. Naruto wondered if his teammate was becoming more expressive, or if he was just learning to read him better. That is completely irrational, Shino finally said in an annoyed tone. Maybe he was just becoming more irritable. Kiba just shrugged. You tell them that. We'll give you an honorable burial, he said with a tight grin. Not a chance, Naruto snapped, his former anger returning. No wonder he was jumpy with all the ill-concealed hostility in the room. Anyone laying a hand on his team better be prepared to have it ripped off. Anyo, Hinata said hesitantly. I think he was just kidding. It's a miracle, Kiba said with wide eyes and a taunting grin. She talks. That crack got him a glare from Shino, which he ignored, and a blush from Hinata, which widened his grin. What it got from Naruto was a narrowing of his eyes and a low growl that seemed to rumble from his chest of its own accord. Akamaru suddenly let out a low whine and made a series of sharp, high-pitched barks. Kiba's eyes widened slightly and then he made a face. It was just a joke, he said with disgust. Get a grip. Your alleged sense of humor leaves much to be desired, Shino said in a dry tone. Yeah, Kiba said dismissively, waving a hand as he turned and began bothering Sasuke. Hey, you guys, an unfamiliar voice called out. You should quiet down a little. Naruto turned along with the rest to see a silver-haired genin approach. Despite his hair, he only appeared to be a few years older. So you're the rookies that just graduated from the academy, correct? No one answered him immediately, but he continued. You're all fooling around, this isn't a field trip. His dismissive tone seemed to irk several of them, but Yamanaka Ino was quickest to reply. Who are you to tell us that? She demanded. I am Yakushi Kabuto, the young man answered, and if you look around you'll see that everyone is on edge. I don't want to see you get singled out. I guess you can't help it, being rookies and not knowing anything. It reminds me of how I was when I first took the exam. Kabuto-san? Sakura asked hesitantly. Is this your second time taking the exam? No, he answered. My seventh. Does that mean you know a lot about the exam? She asked with a hopeful smile. Yes, I suppose it does, Kabuto said with an embarrassed grin. More like he knows how to fail the exam, Shikamaru observed in a bored tone. If the exam is that difficult, it's going to be even more troublesome. Kabuto seemed a little nonplussed about the abrupt dismissal, so he upped the ante. Maybe I should give you kids some information then, with these recognition cards. Naruto tensed as Kabuto reached into his kunai pouch, but he only pulled out some orange and black cards. These have information I burned into them using my chakra, he said. I've collected information on this exam for the last 4 years on these 200 cards. They appear blank, and cannot be read without my chakra. He knelt down and began to turn one on the floor with an extended finger. After a moment, there was a soft pop and a cloud of smoke blew away from the card to reveal a map of the region. On the legend was a tally of the genin entered by each country participating in the exam. As Kabuto began to hold forth on the purpose of the Chunin exams and how they help maintain the balance of power, Naruto was thinking. Why was this guy being so helpful? Was he a friend of one of their senseis? When he tried to look underneath the underneath, it made him a little uneasy. Others might accept a complete stranger helping them out of the goodness of his heart, but Naruto knew that happened pretty seldom, even in Konoha, which Kuranai said was often denigrated by other hidden villages for being too soft. Naruto was wondering what, if any, that his half-formed suspicions when Sasuke spoke up for the first time. Are there any cards that have detailed personal information? Kabuto admitted that they did, and Sasuke asked to see information on Rock Lee and Gaara, earning him a quick look from Naruto. It was a little rude to ask for information on Lee right in front of him, but Naruto wondered how Sasuke even knew Gaara's name. Had he run into the boy as well? Or had his Jonin warned him to stay away from the Suna genin at all costs? Naruto doubted Kuranai would have kept information to herself if it could potentially save the life of an ally, and Naruto had a feeling that anyone going after Sabaku no Gaara unprepared was risking everything. Naruto wondered if he should add his own warning, but how could he reveal what he knew of Gaara without exposing himself? And would the arrogant Uchiha even believe him? Thankfully, the sketchy information that Kabuto had regarding Gaara was enough to make anyone cautious. Completing a B-ranked mission as a genin was almost unheard of, going by Kabuto's expression. The total lack of information regarding the foreign shinobi's capabilities was also an effective warning. Concealed abilities were almost always more dangerous than known ones. And never having been injured on a mission was downright scary. To top things off on the anxiety scale, Kabuto then went into a big explanation of how 5 other villages sent their best genin to compete in this Chunin exam. To compete against a bunch of genin who'd only left the academy a few months ago. Out of the corner of his eye, Naruto saw Hinata looking down. Even Rock Lee looked a little hesitant. Oh no, this would not do. Good, Naruto said in a loud voice, making everyone around him jump. If this was easy, then making Chunin would mean nothing. Strong opponents mean we get to really show what we can do. Right, Hinata? He added the last while gently elbowing his teammate. Hinata's head shot up. "Hi," she chirped, her cheeks already coloring. Naruto gave her a warm smile that seemed to fluster her even worse and then turned to his other teammate. "Right, Shino?" Shino adjusted his glasses calmly, but Naruto thought he could detect a quiet buzzing coming from the Aburame boy. With his arm raised, Naruto noticed that the sleeves of his jacket were cut wider than normal. He had a strong suspicion there was more than just arm in there. "That is correct, Naruto," Shino said, his voice a bit louder than usual. "Good," Naruto said. He then turned toward the nearest older genin, who, although they wore konoha itachi, seemed just as hostile as the foreign shinobi. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage of Konoha, and if you have a problem with me being here, form a line," he roared. The rest of the Rookie 9 and Team Guy were all staring at him incredulously. Ino asked him what the hell he thought he was doing, but he tuned them all out. His attention was on two things. The first was the small smile of approval Hinata gave him. The second was the pair of genin with hidden sound ite making their way toward the group of Konoha nin at high speed. The two sound males appeared to be setting up a combo attack on Kabuto. Even if the older genin was a little patronizing, he was still a Konoha shinobi. As the skinny guy leapt over the crowd and sent a pair of throwing kunai at the silver-haired genin, Naruto was already in motion. Grabbing a thrown kunai out of the air was usually an iffy proposition, given how much of it was sharp and how little of it was safe to grab. But if he just deflected them, they were likely to hit one of the foreign genin and undoubtedly spark a general brawl. Fortunately, Naruto's timing was just right and he was able to grab the handles of the kunai as his path crossed theirs. One sharp edge dug into the palm of his fingerless gloves, but didn't penetrate. Of course, the quick motion of his arms made his body begin tumbling as it continued to fly toward the ceiling. With a wrenching twist, Naruto managed to get his feet to hit the ceiling first, and charged with chakra they held him there upside down. The bulky sound genin was still heading toward Kabuto, but without the thrown kunai backing his target up into the wall. The sound genin had to alter his path to cut through the Konoha rookies. His arm was drawn back for a haymaker swing at the silver-haired genin when Shino stepped into the arc, his own forearm held vertical, the heel of his hand turned outward. The genin's arms clashed with an audible clang, but surprisingly, Shino did not move an inch. The sound genin's one visible eye glared at Shino, but the Aburame genius seemed completely unaffected. "This is unseemly," Shino said, as if he were discussing Naruto's table manners at Ichiraku's. The sound genin's eye narrowed and his other hand moved under his cloak. "Please stop," Hinata said softly as she appeared by Shino's side, her palm extended, glowing with chakra, less than an inch from the bandages that covered most of the sound genin's face. The bulky genin froze in place, and then slowly straightened. Looking down from the ceiling, Naruto also saw Sasuke palm a pair of kunai, Kiba edging around for a better angle, Neji holding Lee back from the fight, and Shikamaru, of all people, standing there with a look of focused concentration on his face. The shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed to be pulled around the Nara boy's feet. The skinny sound genin landed next to his comrade. Hidden Sound is not a minor village, and we don't need to all gang up on someone to stop them, either, he spat, glaring at the rookies. Naruto released the chakra in his feet and jumped down from the ceiling behind the sound genin. To their credit, neither of them jumped at the sudden noise. With a smile he casually handed the kunai back to their owner, who was visibly seething. "You speak of our greatest strength as a weakness," Shino said urbanely. "I find myself pitying you. And if either of you want a piece of me, the offer is still open," Naruto said in a low voice. The lack of intensive physical training the last few days had left him fidgety and just a little irritable too. Just then there was a loud explosion and smoke billowed from the front of the examination room. "Quiet down, you punks," a rough voice bellowed. When the smoke dissipated, Naruto saw a tall scar-faced man sporting a konoha itachi and a black trenchcoat. Flanking him was a squad of chunin dressed in proctor's uniforms, including the two clowns he'd uncovered earlier. "Sorry to keep you waiting," the man, who appeared to be a special jonin of some sort, continued in a smoother voice. "I am the examiner of the first test of the chunin selection exam, Morino Ibiki. Author's notes. I'd like to thank both the genius that is Runsamuk and the incredible and decidedly insane Bibliophile 20 for their absolutely wonderful beta work. They made me add this grin. Before you ask, the preliminary exams in canon didn't happen because Iruka wasn't at the meeting to protest the Rookie 9 being entered in the chunin exam. And a trio of affirmatives today. Yes, I'm back. Some of this was surprisingly hard to put together, and real life, which is highly overrated, wasn't very cooperative at all. Yes, things are a little different than the canon scenes, but I'm sure if you look at everything you will realize why. Yes, the title of this chapter is an intentional pun. My Dinner with Andre was a movie released back in 1981. And yes, I'm including the Team 8 Omake winners from the contest on my blog. Link is in my profile. The winner is Wolfgang Bulin, who wrote a scene that seemed to match the narrative tone of Team 8 the best. Among the shinobi of Konoha, Most tended to have rather clear and defined images of their fellow ninja, sometimes even to the point where a person was defined by the very same picture people had of her, in lieu of what she really was like. It was so common, in fact, that the few ninja who knew better could not help but to shake their heads and ask themselves what had become of underneath. Especially when there were more than just a few cases, with some of them being of village-wide renown. Uzumaki Naruto, of course, was a prime example, with the image of a goofy, orange-clad prankster so deeply ingrained in people's minds that few could even start to imagine him as a solemn and capable ninja. The hyperactive Mitarashi Anko was another surprise, when people heard about her interest in tea ceremonies and tried to envision her wearing a traditional kimono and partaking in such a formal and ritualistic event. Others were of far less renown, like Inuzuka Sume. With her feral look caused by her facial tattoos, shaggy hair, and her pronounced canines, it was easy to envision her on a battlefield, tearing some enemy limb from limb with her dog companion Kuromaru at her side. Some people even went as far as picturing her how she tore out someone's throat with her bare teeth. The thought of her as a loving mother and housewife seemed pretty ridiculous in comparison. Therefore, more than just a few people would have stopped dead in their tracks and make a double take at the sight of the Inuzuka woman wearing a green apron in front of her kitchen's hearth and cooking a meal. 2 meals, in fact. One for her son, and another one for Akamaru. Originally, she had intended this as a small celebration of her son's first C-rank mission's completion. And while this hadn't exactly changed, it now had the added purpose of lifting Kiba's spirits a bit, and distracting him from the mission's sad outcome. "How much longer, Mom?" "Just a few minutes. And the more you ask, the longer it'll be," she replied. As far as it seemed, her distraction was working. After recounting his tale of the mission, Kiba was now fully concentrated on the fact that his mother was preparing the favorite foods of both him and Akamaru and played impatiently with his chopsticks. In the meanwhile, the small white dog was still busy relaying his own point of view on the events to Kuromaru, who interjected at several points with questions or comments of his own. The result was a conversation that consisted of innumerable low barks, yips, growls, and similar sounds only an Inuzuka would be able to decipher. Right now, though, Kiba was too preoccupied with his meal, and Sume only listened half-heartedly as she checked the pot with Akamaru's food. "How's your team coming along after this?" Sasuke's trying to act like a cold and indifferent jerk, Kiba began and added a muttered, as always, under his breath before he continued. "But I can tell that it's bothering him. Sakura said that he expects a lot from himself, so he's probably both angry and disappointed that it didn't went very well." "And Sakura? Well, she's very down as well, even more than Sasuke, in fact." "How come?" Although she was busy preparing the meal, her question was proof that she still paid attention to her son. He paused to scratch his cheek while thinking of an answer. In the background, he could hear Akamaru's and Kuromaru's chatter, without really listening to them. "I think she's pretty disappointed in herself, even more so than Sasuke. Most of the time, she couldn't do much beside covering Tazuna-san. Sasuke, Kakashi-sensei and I handled the fighting against the enemy ninja. I guess she might have felt, well, useless. And maybe she's disappointed in Sasuke as well. Or rather, in the fact that he didn't live up to the image she had of him," he shrugged. "She tries to cover her worries by behaving as violent and aggressive as usual, though. She's not unlike Sis in that manner. Don't tell her I said that, though." "Tell what to whom?" Upon hearing the voice of his very own sister as she entered the room, Kiba shot a pleading glance towards his mother. Sume just gave him a smile. "Nothing. Just that both you and Sakura are violent and aggressive." Chuckling to herself, she returned her attention toward the food she prepared and listened to the squabble between her 2 children that ensued. It ended soon enough, as this kind of fight often did, and she finally got the opportunity to put the meal on the table. She noticed that Akamaru was still busy telling his story to Kuromaru, though he seemed to slowly reach the end. "It seems this year's got some strong and interesting pups," Kuromaru mentioned in the human tongue as soon as Akamaru had finished his story. Turning towards his partner, he was met with a questioning look. "Kiba and his pack, now, and the pack we met on the hunt a few days ago," he elaborated in response. Sume spent a few moments searching through her memory before her eyes lit up in understanding. "Ah, you mean Kurenai's team." Kiba stopped in his meal to throw his mother a questioning look. "Naruto, Hinata, and Shino. I met them on the way back. What's with them?" "They were on a border patrol mission just a few days ago and we ran into them during a rescue mission. Didn't they tell you?" she asked with her eyebrows raised in surprise. From what she had heard about them from Kiba's school stories, she would have expected for Naruto to brag about the events, at least. Shrugging slightly, she began to fill in Kiba on what happened. 3 missing nin of B-Day rank kidnapped 2 inhabitants of our village and escaped toward the border that Kurenai's team patrolled. They intercepted the missing nin and defeated them shortly before the rescue team that I was a part of arrived. I don't know the details, but Naruto killed at least one of them." "Naruto killed one of them?" Kiba asked in disbelief with such a funny face that Sume couldn't help but let out a bark of laughter that was joined by her daughter. "I wouldn't believe it, myself, if Kuromaru hadn't told me." Hana supported her mother's claim, although her attention was more focused on Akamaru. The exchange between her mother and little brother didn't interest her too much, since she already had heard the story from her mother a couple of days earlier. Instead, she beckoned the white dog to come to her and bribed him with a few pieces of meat from her food to tell her about the mission he and Kiba just had returned from. Although he had his very own meal, the prospect of some extra food made him happy to comply. He smelled of fresh blood, Kuromaru explained in the meantime to Kiba. As he opened his mouth, probably for some sort of protest, the canine interjected. Human blood. Apparently, the black dog wasn't too pleased with the fact that Kiba wanted to doubt either his nose or his statement. I guess you'll have to ask them yourself, if you want the whole story. We had to return to Konoha immediately after retrieving the 2 kidnappees from Kurenai's team. I hadn't even the time to taste out the cooking of the Hyuga girl. The last sentence Sume muttered more to herself than to her son. Damn that Hiyashi. Who would have been hurt if they had stayed and rested for a night, or a few hours at least? Hinata had seemed like she did her very best to prepare a good meal for them, and from the appetizing look and smell it had, she had done a damn good job at it. Somehow, it seemed like Hiyashi went out of his way to make his daughter feel miserable, which was something Sume couldn't even begin to wrap her head around. Meanwhile, Kiba stared down at his meal with a mixture of emotions. Disbelief and anger were the prevalent ones, with a good deal of confusion thrown in as well. He and Sasuke had fought and bled and cursed together just to bring down a single enemy nin, whereas Naruto managed not only to defeat one as well, but completely on his own if what Kuromaru had told him was true. That just couldn't be right. After all, Naruto had been a complete loser at the academy. As the moments passed, however, Kiba noted something entirely different, the fact that the Naruto now seemed different from the one he remembered from the academy. When he met him today, he didn't brag about it like he should have without hesitation. And if he remembered the clash at the ramen bar correctly, Naruto didn't shout or scream at that time, either, and just left instead. Kiba wasn't sure what besides asking himself the obvious question, how much did you change exactly, Naruto? And the runner-up is Alla, who offered an intriguing look into the life of an Inuzuka. Inuzuka Kiba couldn't help a relieved smile as the delicious smells of meat stew and fresh leather home hit his nostrils. Comfortably snuggled into what was left of Kiba's jacket, Akamaru yowled sleepily, keeping his eyes closed. Kiba shared his companion's sentiment. He felt thrashed, not that he'd ever admit it. He envisioned a warm meal, and then a warmer bed, and he couldn't decide whether he was more hungry or tired. Kiba approached the cottage from the direction of the wind, letting it announce his arrival. He knew, from a previous unfortunate experience involving nighttime, a bet, and sake, that there was no way to creep past his family's noses and ears. Even if he could fool his sisters and the dogs, which in itself was no small feat, his mother or father would always know. Passing the last tree, he brushed his shoulder against it, leaving his mark while taking in his family's. His mother was home, the tree's scents told him. His sisters were home earlier that morning. His father's trace was fainter than he remembered, still away, probably in the latest long-range mission with his hunter nin uncles. As he entered the dining room, his gaze was drawn to the steaming bowl on the table, then to the left, where his mother Inuzuka Sume was putting the finishing touches on a familiar-looking, brand-new piece of leatherwork. A smaller bowl was on the floor under his chair, and immediately Akamaru's head popped up from Kiba's collar and he struggled to break free. They both sat down before their meal. "Welcome back, pup," Sume said, as she embraced him from behind. Kiba grunted gratefully, engrossed in the wonderful waft coming from the soup. Sume smiled and nudged his back, letting him know that he should tuck in. For the few seconds it took the pair to devour dinner, the room was silent. Then Sume refilled their plates and sat down as well. "How did it go?" Kiba mumbled, "Fine," and paused between mouthfuls, looking back at the mission to find something he should say to quickly sum it up. For some reason, the image of his bed kept popping up in his mind. When he found something suitably impressive, he started gesturing and talking. Akamaru was amazing. You should have seen it. When a missing nin was distracted, he chomped on his leg, and kept him still so Sasuke chibi and I could nail him good. Sume raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. The senbon holes, and the smells of blood from Kiba's ruined clothes, still present even after his washing them, told of a brutal fight. There was her son's blood, far too much of it for her comfort, and she smelled his teammates, and Akamaru and someone else as well. At that time she wasn't feeling particularly impressed with Kakashi's judgment. She reached down and lifted Akamaru up, closely examining his bruised body. "Good boy," she simply said, then she touched his muzzle with her nose and gave a good lick at his collar. Akamaru panted in adoration at what amounted to highest praise, then shot towards the kennel, eager to show off the pack leader's scent to his brothers and sisters. "I feel neglected now," Kiba joked, pouting, and Sume smirked at him. "See if that jacket fits you then," she said, pointing at her handiwork from before. Kiba couldn't suppress a grin as he passed his hand over the perfect fur. "Thanks, Mom. I'll try to make this one last longer." Sume considered letting her son rest. He seemed oddly subdued, which spoke of exhaustion, certainly, but what if there was something more? She took in his appearance and made a decision. "Tell me everything." Kiba sighed. As he told her the full story, properly embellishing his own contribution, Kiba could detect his mother's alternating tension and relief, just as he knew she would sense his own elation and excitement. There were very little secrets in the Inuzuka clan. When both you and your family could easily smell strong emotions such as anger and fear and embarrassment, being anything less than straightforward was just futile. Which suited Kiba's character just fine, thank you very much, and in fact had a big part in forming such character in the first place. And then we got back, Kiba concluded. Sume got up and absently refilled his bowl a third time. Her son looked at her expression and some of it suddenly made sense. "Is Kakashi-sensei in trouble?" he asked. She laughed and said, "We'll see," which Kiba correctly interpreted as a resounding, yes. Then Sume got serious and asked, "When you found out the leaf had been tricked into accepting the mission, you were given the choice to return. Why didn't you?" Kiba thought about what to say. The largest part of it, he knew, was that Inuzuka Kiba does not turn back from danger, especially not when his two teammates jump into the thick of it without hesitation. Such a revelation, he suspected, wouldn't go down well with his mother. But as he pondered more, he discovered another truth that he'd always known, just never recognized. And it did sound loads better. That village that lied to us. They really needed our help, Mom. Sume didn't look at him then, but he didn't need her to. Just seeing her shoulders relax, Kiba immediately knew he had said just the right thing, and could imagine her lips had that light smile she made when she was either happy or proud, or both. And he thought, "Off the hook, Gomi. Bed, here I come." It wasn't to be. Still looking away, Sume said, "Kiba, what does your father tell you is the best thing about the Inuzuka clan?" Kiba grinned. "That we can smell when a girl is an ow, Mom." Sume put the kettle back in the cupboard. "The other thing." Kiba felt the growing lump on his head, grumbling. "Should have specified. It's that every Inuzuka knows his place in the pack." He cleared his throat and tried imitating his father's gruff voice. "It's not your nose, cub, but patience that is the key to tracking. The most powerful combat technique in the world is the wait until your opponent is asleep jutsu. And never, ever forget your place in the pack." Sume nodded. "Glad you listened to that. Go on." She kept looking at him, and when Kiba didn't add anything and just stared dumbly, she sighed. Kiba was trying his best to look thoughtful, but this was quickly turning into the kind of girly conversation that normally had him running for his life. However, he was also well aware of the fact that Inuzuka Sume would not be deterred by anything, much less her son's utter lack of interest. He had to show an effort before his eventual escape. "Let me tell you something," Sume said eventually. "While you were on your mission, 3 missing nins came to our village and kidnapped a Hyuga child and the Hokage's grandson. I took Kuromaru with me and we lead the pursuit. The tracks showed they were running for the border, probably would have made it across before we got them, but they were intercepted by a few of your classmates. It was Kurenai Yui's team." Sume knew she had her son's attention then. "Aburame, Hyuga, and Uzumaki?" he asked. She nodded, and Kiba scoffed. "Well, that's probably why they seemed so down when I saw them, earlier today. They must have gotten their asses kicked pretty bad." Sume arched her eyebrow. "Actually, when we arrived, the hostages had already been rescued and all missing nins were dead. And those 3 guys weren't exactly pushovers either. From what I gathered, the Aburame and Hyuga kids were in trouble early in the fight. The last enemy was killed by Kurenai after Uzumaki had dispatched the first 2. Before his mission in Water Country, Kiba would have protested loudly by this time, that he knew how Uzumaki Naruto was a next to useless ninja, and the only jutsu he'd mastered, only made things worse by creating even more useless ninjas. Now, however, Kiba couldn't help but remember Naruto's somber expression, while finding a disturbingly similar feeling resonating in him. Naruto's wasn't the look of success, right after you got a glimpse of the attached price tag. While frantically trying to stamp down on his newfound respect for the fellow genin, Kiba realized that his mother hadn't stopped talking, and he hadn't been listening. "And that cute kid even prepared dinner for all of us. I was impressed. So, Kiba," Sume finished sagely, "Kurenai's team is a good pack." Kiba nodded mutely, perfectly aware that there was something important his mother had been trying to convey, that had passed miles above his head. As he got up and reached his bed, he had an uncharacteristic buzzing in his head, which only grew louder as his body shut down. It wasn't making sense. Kiba openly admired his parents. He loved being in Inuzuka and the huge world of sensation his blood and training opened for him. But he knew his role in Team 7, and it was nothing like Naruto's. He was the tracker, he would warn the others about danger, and Akamaru and him were handy in a fight. One day he would be just as strong as his father, which was more than enough to get things done. And that was it. All Naruto did was, well, be loud and obnoxious and eat ramen. And he'd killed 2 missing nins. Big deal. After Hyuga and Aburame had been taken out, his mother said. It dawned on him right then, at the edge of sleep. It wasn't about fighting or anything else. What Naruto had done was protect his teammates, That was Naruto's place in the pack. The same as mine, he whispered. Inspired by his discovery, he turned it around in his head. Did he like it? Was it enough for him? Was it worth the trouble? Would it matter if his worth was recognized or not? Unbidden, images from the previous days came to mind. Kiba wondered at Sasuke's expression of triumph as those weird things appeared in his eyes, and he could suddenly see into the future. Kiba figured the future wasn't a happy place. Then Kiba stared at Sakura's tear-stained face as she broke down crying and hugged them both, her arms painfully constricting their necks. Right after the tragedy on the bridge, girl had muscles. Yeah, Kiba decided, it will have to do, he would keep his pack safe. After all, they wouldn't stand a chance without him. Chapter 12. Naruto stared down at his paper, holding his head in his hands. The rules, as explained by the scarred special Jonin, were pretty straightforward. The teams were split up into randomly assigned seats before the test papers were passed out. Everyone started with 10 points, but wrong answers cost a point for each question. Getting caught cheating cost you 2 points every time you were caught. Run out of points and get removed from the exam. Simple, right? Oh, and if you get a 0 your teammates fail as well. Just answer the questions and don't cheat, right? Except for the fact that Uzumaki Naruto was abysmally bad with written tests. They were the bane of his existence at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Practical exercises were different. He failed a lot of those too, but at least there was a chance. Sometimes he could figure out a way to succeed or work around the rules. Like with the kunai throwing examination. Iruka hadn't specifically forbidden him to use an explosive tag, and the bull's eye was certainly destroyed, even if he'd struck the target 3 inches to the left of center. But a written test, there was only one way to answer them correctly. No way to distract the examiner and move the starting line. And only one correct way to actually do the problem. No room for creativity at all. A drop of sweat rolled down Naruto's forehead and traced a path down his nose. He rubbed at it irritably. At least the first question wasn't multiple choice. The parabola, B, represents a shuriken's path after being thrown by an enemy ninja from a height of 7 meters. Calculate the strength of the enemy ninja that can be observed from the trajectory followed by the shuriken and figure out the maximum throwing distance on flat ground. Explain your reasoning. Oh crap, he thought with horror, it's even worse, they want me to do math. Hinata leaned forward with her eyes closed, appearing to be lost in thought to an outside observer. This motion also caused her short hair to hang slightly forward along the sides of her face, as her hands moved under the desk. She also carefully twisted her concealed fingers into the seals that would activate her family blood limit, whispering, Byakugan, in a ghost of a whisper. Her chakra flow was so slow and so controlled that the students on either side of her didn't even look up. The bulging veins on her temples were now concealed by her hair, so she gave no outward sign as her closed eyes scanned the papers of nearby candidates. If she was going to cheat, as this test seemed to require, she was determined not to get caught. Finding one who seemed to have filled out most of his test, she began memorizing his answers. Everything was going according to plan. She'd hoped when they began assigning seats that she'd be able to sit near Naruto-kun, but of course the random assignments would be altered to separate teammates. Much as she wished she could help her friends, she was confident that they would find some way to succeed. Ushino nodded slightly as his spy returned. A specially bred subspecies of Kikai, it had extremely well-developed compound eyes to assist with reconnaissance missions. Unfortunately, its brain wasn't quite as well-developed, though he could communicate with it easily by using one of his attuned queens. Its conversational skills were as underdeveloped as those of his teammate when contemplating hot ramen. In addition, the flying insect's memory was only sufficient to memorize a single answer at a time. Though tedious to use, it was effective nonetheless. He only hoped that his teammates were also finding ways to succeed. A single 0 would bar the entire team from progressing. Naruto sweated as he looked over the other test questions. None of them looked particularly easy. Most of them he felt he could eventually puzzle out given unlimited time or access to the right books, but he had neither at the moment. Why is this test so freaking hard? He asked himself, grinding his teeth in frustration. I don't think anyone in my class, except maybe Sakura, could answer all of these in time. Why did they even let us take this test? We're not going to get any experience if we fail in the first hour? That gave him pause, and Naruto's face went blank as he pondered this. Kurenai-sensei wouldn't put them into this situation if it was impossible, so there had to be a way around it. He went over the rules again, how the points were awarded and how points were deducted if you were caught cheating. Funny how lenient that was. Iruka-sensei would kick you out of the classroom if he caught you cheating on one of his tests. Naruto's eyes narrowed. Why is this test so hard, but easier on that one aspect? It's almost like they want to encourage, I'm an idiot. This is a shinobi rank exam. They want to see how sneaky we can be. Right at that moment, one of the proctors called out a number, making Naruto jump in his seat. Number 52, you fail, he said in a bored tone. 17 and 43. You can follow your teammate out into the hall. Naruto glanced over at the Chunin as the angry genin filed out of the room. The predatory gleam in the older shinobi's eyes held a hint of triumph, but no anger or outrage. His suspicions were correct. The Chunin proctors were his real opponents. As more teams were eliminated, Naruto began to sweat harder. He needed to find the answers, but he kept his eyes on his own paper. Those proctors were not messing around. It wasn't until one of the shinobi wearing a Suna marker and lots of face paint asked to be excused that he got some inspiration. Less than a minute later, Naruto had the rough outlines of a plan worked out. He just wished he had Shino handy to look for flaws. "What is it, 23? The young-looking proctor on his row said when Naruto raised his hand. "I need to go to the bathroom too," Naruto stammered. He grimaced and held his stomach. "I think I drank some bad milk," he added. The proctor didn't react, other than to smoothly rise to his feet and gesture for Naruto to follow. Naruto wisely kept his eyes down for the most part, but out of the corner of his eye he saw Sakura look up, eyes widening in surprise, as they walked past. In a quiet voice, the proctor directed him to go down the stairs to second floor, before proceeding down the hall. Naruto guessed that they wanted to make sure he and that Tsunanen didn't come into contact. That was fine with him. If he was with Sabaku no Gara, he was at least dangerous by proxy. But to Naruto's dismay, the proctor followed him into the bathroom, standing beside the sinks. Naruto clutched his stomach again and ducked into one of the stalls. Aware that the Chunin could see under the stall doors, Naruto dropped his trousers and sat down. He also pushed up the jacket sleeve on his left arm, leaving the skin of his forearm exposed. After pausing long enough to very carefully mold the chakra, he coughed loudly as his fingers formed the seals. There was a loud pop, immediately supplemented by Naruto placing his mouth on his forearm and blowing hard. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space as mist billowed out under the stall door. In a flash, Naruto fixed his sleeve and pulled his pants up. He flushed and opened the stall door and stepped out toward the sinks, in time to see the Chunin edging back from the smoke. "Gomen," Naruto said as he quickly washed his hands. "Definitely some bad milk, but I'm lucky it was just gas. Wouldn't want to do that in the middle of the exam though." The Chunin didn't say a word, but his steps as he led Naruto back to the examination room were a bit quicker than before, as if he was reluctant to let Naruto get too close. No sooner did the sound of their footsteps fade within the bathroom than the other stall doors flew open and the three Narutos crouched on top of the toilets jumped out. Their faces screwed up in concentration as they made the seals with their hands, and suddenly they were replaced by Amino Iruka, Maeda Gai, and Yuichi Kuranai. The two Fo Jonin and the Fo Chunin left the bat with purpose. But not before washing their hands, of course. It was fortunate that no one was on hand to wonder what the Genjutsu mistress was doing in the male restroom. Moving quickly across the rooftops of Konoha, the three clones descended on the library. They only had a handful of minutes to get the information Naruto needed and get it back to him. Luckily, each only needed to look up information for 3 or 4 questions, and Naruto had already given some thought on where to find the information. So while the Kuranai clone was opening up a book on ciphers, looking for a match to the one seen on the exam, the Iruka clone had a physics book open and was scratching down equations for the Kanai problem, and the Gai clone was looking up the names of the founding kage for each village. Working independently, the Kage Bunshin found the answers, or most of the answers, within their allotted time and met up at the entrance to the library. But as they made their way back to the building where the examination was being held, the final obstacle confronted them, one the original Naruto didn't have enough information about to work out ahead of time. Their information was useless if they couldn't get it to Naruto before the test was over. With all the foreign shinobi, the building was heavily guarded, and getting out without speaking to someone was a lot easier than getting back in. The closest they could get without a risky encounter was a rooftop that had a view of the side windows to the examination room. Using a well-polished forehead protector as a mirror, they tried to reflect the midday sun at an angle to catch Naruto's eye. Using a signal code to transmit their information would be time-consuming, but it was better than nothing at all. The only problem was the original Naruto's determination to not get caught cheating. He never looked up enough for the light to catch his eye. Unfortunately, their efforts did not go completely unnoticed. "I can't believe you three," an annoyed-sounding voice spoke up behind them. In spite of themselves, the three clones jumped guiltily and spun around. A Konoha shinobi with a cloth over his head and a senbon needle in the corner of his mouth was glaring at them. "I thought it was a little odd to hear about such young teens in the exam, but I never thought I'd find some of you cheating for your students. The Hokage is going to be very disappointed." The Kuranai clone, realizing the man's assumption, spoke up without thinking. "No, don't," he pleaded, before he realized that he wasn't acting anything at all like his cool and rational sensei. The thought of getting Kuranai sensei in trouble with the Hokage had evidently short-circuited his common sense. The other shinobi picked up on this as well. "Okay, who the hell are you?" he demanded as senbon needles appeared between his curled fingers. When the clones didn't immediately answer, he whipped his hands up and flung the needles at the imposters. The clones tried to dodge the missiles. Often senbon were coated with drugs or poisons to disable the target, but given how much chakra they had left, the first hit would be fatal. But as they crouched down or threw themselves to the side, the Konoha shinobi did a seal and the senbon seemed to multiply in midair. Each clone was punctured by one or more needles and exploded into a puff of smoke. Naruto abruptly stiffened in his seat as his brain was suddenly flooded with information. That jerk, he cursed to himself, why did he have to interfere with? Wait, how'd I know what happened to my clones? I wasn't there. His questions cut off as he abruptly realized that he had the information needed for the test now. He went back to the first question and began writing down the equations before he forgot them. There would be plenty of time to think about his clones when he wasn't taking a test. Naruto's pencil moved frantically as he filled in the squares allotted for his answers. As he provided workable solutions to the first 9 questions, the knot in his stomach slowly began to loosen. It was by no means perfect, but at least he'd been able to show his work on all of them, a better showing than he'd ever made at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Of course, all his nervous tension quickly returned when Ibiki's voice jarred him out of his reverie, almost making him drop his pencil. Okay, the scary-looking man barked. I will now give the 10th problem. Naruto couldn't help but glance at the clock. Indeed, 45 minutes had passed since the beginning of the test. It had only felt like an eternity. This Ibiki guy really should be working at the academy. He was perfect for that place. His musings were cut short as the weird Suna shinobi finally returned from the bathroom, only to get a sarcastic remark from the examiner. Naruto wondered if the guy didn't get enough fiber in his diet. He certainly looked dyspeptic enough as he returned to his seat. I will now explain, the scar-faced man in the black trench coat continued. This is a hopeless rule. First, you are all going to choose if you wish to take this 10th problem or not. Choose? Asked a blonde kunoichi with a tsunahite ite worn loosely around her neck like hinata. Despite her hairstyle, she was the most normal-looking person from Suna that he'd noticed so far. If you choose not to take it, your points will be reduced to 0. Ibiki answered with a faint smile. In other words, you will fail. Your 2 teammates will fail along with you. That statement, of course, sparked off a low rumble of muttered comments and denials from the remaining candidates. Naruto's eyes narrowed. This couldn't be that easy. And here is the other rule, Ibiki continued, ignoring them all as he seemed to savor the moment. If you choose to take it and you get it wrong, you will lose the privilege of taking the Chunin exam forever. Unsurprisingly, Inuzuka Kiba was the first to break the shocked silence. What kind of dumb rule is that? He demanded. There are people here who have taken the Chunin exam in the past, of course. The boy's indignant fury was not enhanced by the small white dog on his head punctuating his statement with 2 high-pitched barks. Ibiki just laughed at that, a sound that seemed to send chills down Naruto's back to gather in the pit of his stomach. You are unlucky, he said. This year, I am the rule. That is why I give you the option of quitting. Those who are not confident can choose not to take it, and take the exam next year, or the year after that. He chuckled again, and Naruto felt his jaw clench. Let us begin, Ibiki said. Those who will not be taking the 10th question, raise your hands. After we confirm your numbers, we will have you leave. After a long moment, the first hand went up from a seat near Naruto. An older-looking Konoha genin with a goatee and a pinched-looking face stood up. I quit, he said, looking like he was in pain. I won't take it. The man apologized to his teammates as their numbers were called out as well, but the one Naruto could see didn't seem to mind very much. As he turned to watch them file out, he saw Hinata. She seemed to have shrunk down in her seat and her face had gone very pale. He tried to give her an encouraging smile, but her eyes seemed frantic with worry. That puzzled Naruto as he turned back around. Hinata didn't seem to be that concerned with her rank, so much as becoming stronger so her father would appreciate her, the bastard. So why? Then it hit him. His dream was to become Hokage, not hers. She was worried about him. Naruto frowned as he pondered this. That first surrender seemed to open the floodgates as others raised their hands. After their numbers were called, each team filed silently out of the room. Some looked relieved, some looked angry, but to Naruto, the worst were the ones who filed out silently, their faces impassive masks. He wondered if those would remain shinobi much longer. He doubted those teams would remain intact for the next Chunin exam. How bad would it be, to fail the examination because their nerve? Or chose to make the team fail so they didn't personally risk being barred forever from Chunin? Naruto's eyes narrowed as they focused on the chief examiner. He was playing with them in some sick way. The man had a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. Seeing that, and remembering Hinata's obvious distress made something inside of him snap. In a sick way, it was gratifying to have someone more concerned about his ambitions than their own, but she deserved a lot better than to be tormented for it. He couldn't talk to her, and hand signals were not practical for this, so he'd had to do it indirectly. Naruto vaulted onto his desk, taking care not to step on his test paper. He pointed accusingly at Ibiki and yelled, "This is a load of crap." The examining room went dead silent. Hinata's hand was twitching, about to be raised, when Naruto-kun's voice rang out. She'd been engaged in a fierce internal debate in the short time since the terms of the 10th question had been explained. She didn't want to see the end of Naruto's ambitions occur in this stuffy classroom. It would crush him if he was forever limited to genin, and she didn't ever want to see such a thing happen. For a moment she wondered if this whole examination had been constructed as a trap to trick Naruto into destroying his dreams. Once, she would never have thought people could be so cruel, but the more time she spent with Naruto, the more she saw how he was treated. There were adults in Konoha who wouldn't hesitate to do something so cruel in an effort to avenge themselves on what they saw as the Kyuubi no Kitsune. She wasn't sure if Naruto saw the trap laid before him or not. Would it be up to her to save him from himself? She darted a quick glance at Shino, but he seemed unperturbed by the situation. Not that he ever really showed any emotion when he was caught off guard. Her hand had been trembling from nervous tension when Naruto's shouted accusation made her go rigid in her seat. Number 23, what is your problem? The examiner asked in a bored tone. Even if they gave you the authority to make such a rule, Naruto growled, do you think another village's cage will cooperate and not allow their own genin to ever test again? You seem awfully sure of that, Ibiki said. Are you willing to bet your future on that? This is a choice that will impact the rest of your life. Naruto put his fists on his hips and straightened up even more. Hinata's breath caught in her throat. I bet my life every time I go on a mission and I never give up. It's my way of the ninja. And even if they did let you bar me forever, I'll still get stronger and I'll just be the first genin to become Hokage, and then I'll fire your ass for making up stupid rules. With that, Hinata relaxed a little, because it was true. Naruto would not let them stop him from realizing his ambitions. She was wrong to have doubted him, even for a second. She was wondering if she should get up on her desk as well, to show her support when the examiner spoke at last. We'll see if your gamble pays off, 23. Now get off that desk before I disqualify you immediately for insubordination. Naruto hopped back into his chair, but Hinata could still faintly feel the waves of killer intent coming from her teammate. For the rest of you, this is your last chance to leave before your fate is sealed. The scar-faced examiner announced in a deep voice that made Hinata's insides twist. She concentrated on the spike of anger that came from her friend. She would see it through with him, or not at all. As teammate, friend, or even the chunin guarding the door to his office, where you lead, she would follow, watching his back. Ibiki-san waited, looking around the room, but Hinata didn't think anyone else would leave after Naruto's words. And she was right. For the first exam, everyone here passes. Naruto stared at the examiner, wondering if he'd heard him correctly. Sakura, surprisingly, was the first to ask the question they were all thinking. Wait, what's the meaning of that? We pass already. What about the 10th question? That led to one of the scariest things Naruto had ever seen, even worse than Guy and Lee singing karaoke of I got you, babe, at Lee's celebration. Morino Ibiki was laughing. Not a sarcastic chuckle, either. A full-blown, mouth hanging open, belly laugh. There was no such thing to begin with. He explained with a wide smile that made Naruto want to reach for a kunai, or you can call the choice you made the real 10th question. So what were those previous 9 problems? The Tsunakunoichi asked in an annoyed tone. It was all a waste. No, it wasn't, Ibiki disagreed. Those problems accomplished their purpose, testing each individual's information-gathering skills. As Ibiki explained how testing as a group just added to the tension, since people didn't want to let their teams down, it just reinforced Naruto's opinion that the man was a natural sadist, and that his guesses about the test had been correct. At least that was somewhat gratifying. It wasn't until the examiner removed the cloth covering the top of his head that Naruto was distracted from his musings. He had a similar cloth for concealing his bright hair color, but Ibiki's was for a far different purpose. Information can have greater value than life at times, and in missions or on battlefields, he said as everyone stared at the gouges and massive keloid scars that covered the top of his head, leaving no hair at all on the ruined scalp. Information is paid for with the lives of people. If you are detected acquiring information, the enemy can then account for that, making it far less useful. They may even use what you learned to lure your side into a trap. Ibiki continued as he retied the cloth around the top of his head. That can lead to a disaster for your team and your village. So he eliminated those that were not able to gather information without being caught. But then what about that last question? The Tsunakunoichi asked, although this time in a much more subdued voice. That question was the main point of this exam, Ibiki answered, spreading his arms dramatically. You were presented with a do or die situation, being given the choice to go for the question or not. Look at it this way. You're a chunin, and your mission is to capture a secret do, but the opposition, their numbers, and their capabilities are unknown. There may be traps set up in advance by the enemy. Now, will you accept this mission or not? Just because your life and the lives of your teammates may be in danger, are you able to avoid dangerous missions? The answer is no. Naruto frowned, trying to reconcile this with what Kuranai-sensei had been telling him. She'd been awfully cautious about all the situations Team 8 seemed to get into, but she hadn't turned down the border patrol mission, had she? And Kuranai-sensei had agreed that Hinata was right to lead them against the kidnappers. Maybe it was less avoiding dangerous missions than it was planning ahead and working to minimize those dangers? There are missions that carry heavy risks, Ibiki continued, but cannot be avoided. This is what we look for in a chunin, or squad leader. Those who cannot bet their lives in a critical situation. Those who give up when given the chance because there is a next year, and let their minds be swayed over an uncertain future. They are fools with no determination who have no right to become a chunin. You're here because you gave the right answer for the 10th question, and you can deal with the difficulties you will face. Naruto blinked and swallowed. The first portion of the chunin examination ends now, Ibiki announced. I wish you luck, he concluded in a voice that sounded strangely sincere to Naruto. Of course, this touching scene was utterly disrupted when a dark object exploded through the side windows in a hail of glass that narrowly missed the head examiner. 2 kunai were thrown into the ceiling supporting the ding bundle of dark cloth. When the cloth finished unfolding behind the figure straightening up from her landing, it announced, Second examiner, Mitarashi Anko is here, in kanji characters 2 feet tall. To say the woman was dressed oddly, even by Konoha shinobi standards, was to make a massive understatement. She wore a skin-tight metal mesh bodysuit that ended well above her knees, along with shin guards over her sandals, a very short miniskirt, and a tan, knee-length trench coat. Everyone, there's no time to be happy, she announced. I am the second examiner, Mitarashi Anko. As if they couldn't read. Let's go to the next exam, she roared, raising her fist into the air. Follow me. The silence as all the genin stared at her was deafening. I don't think they get you, Ibiki said quietly as he stepped out from behind the hanging cloth. She didn't answer, but just frowned at the remaining candidates. Ibiki, she said out of the corner of her mouth. Why did you let so many pass? The first exam must have been too soft, she concluded with a glare. It looks like there are a lot of good students this time, Ibiki said diplomatically, and Naruto had the impression that they'd known each other before the exams. Oh well, she said. I'm going to have to make more than half the teams fail in the next exam. I'm getting excited. Naruto swallowed. If anything, she was even weirder than Ibiki. I will explain the details tomorrow, Anko announced. We will go somewhere else, so ask your Junin sensei about the rally point and time. That is all. Dismissed. Several of the Konoha Jonin sensei were occupying an unused lounge at the Hokage's tower. The space was normally a backup ready room used when a full anbu muster was called, something that almost never happened. But the seats were comfortable, there was an ashtray for a summa, and talking amongst themselves gave the Jonin something to do while their students were tested. The fact that the Hokage always reserved the room for them, and that it was far away from the examination building, was surely just a coincidence. Despite her intentions, Yuichi Kuranai found herself on edge as she sat there, brooding about how her team would do, especially under a sadistic genius like Morino Ibiki. She'd come to know Ibiki from her debriefing after the disaster that claimed the lives of her sensei and teammates. It was only later that she realized the significance of having a man of his talents in charge, but by that point she could view the circumstances dispassionately enough to understand. When all but one member of a team was wiped out, it was natural that there should be some suspicions. Had she betrayed them? Was she a disguised infiltrator? Had she struck a deal with the attackers to spare her life? Ibiki listened once to her fragmentary, disjointed description of what had happened. He asked her a few questions, and then sent her off to the hospital to have her wounds tended. He visited her there several times to check off various details in her story, but his face had not betrayed any signs of disbelief, or any other emotion. It wasn't until over a month later, when she'd had time to think about what had happened and gone looking for him, that she discovered he was the head of the Anbu torture and interrogation unit. The realization that she'd been under suspicion when she returned was daunting, but it didn't stop her from telling him of her own thoughts. He'd stared at her for a long moment after she finished. His eyes flickered toward the seals painted on the walls and she realized that, with his door closed, his office was one of the few places in Konoha that guaranteed absolute privacy. That's when he agreed with her that the circumstances of the attack did not add up. Too much force had been used to gain too small an objective. There was something else at stake. That much was clear. He'd also cautioned her to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself until such time as she had ironclad proof of her accusations, lest she be made to join her team in the afterlife. Kuranai's stomach was churning as she left that meeting, which Morino Ibiki had logged as the final debriefing from aborted mission number 2579B. It was gratifying that he'd taken her seriously. Too many sexist fools would disregard the words of young Kunoichi, regardless of her intelligence. It was a relief that such a professional agreed that something was going on here. She wasn't just suffering from paranoid delusions triggered by her grief. But at the same time, his observations had chilled her. Whoever had set them up had access to resources and information to a degree that was frankly terrifying when she stopped to consider the implications. And this unknown party had demonstrated no compunctions about shedding blood to achieve their goal. Her future survival truly depended on her discretion. She'd never felt so alone as she walked back to her family's house. Fortunately, they were out of town on a visit to one of her father's suppliers in Wind Country when she'd returned to Konoha. At least she'd been able to spare her mother the worry of her only daughter being in the hospital. But any mistakes she made if she tried to pursue an investigation could cost them their lives as well, so she decided to wait until they returned and speak to them both. A week later, a scroll arrived, detailing the fire that claimed her parents' lives. At that point, Yuichi Kuranai realized what being all alone really meant. Kuranai shook her head, as if to clear it of unwanted memories, and glanced up at the clock. The test should be over by now. She glanced at the others sitting there. Kakashi was reading one of his little orange books. Guy was doing one-armed push-ups on the floor, and Asuma was smoking and trying to talk Guy into joining him in some elaborate betting pool regarding the exam results. The door to the temporary waiting room opened and everyone looked up. However, instead of Ibiki with the test results, they saw two of the younger special Jonin, Gekko Hayate and Shiranui Genma. The latter stopped after entering the room and just started laughing for some strange reason. "What's so funny?" Asuma asked in a faintly belligerent tone. Hayate just shook his head and elbowed Genma. "Sorry, but we have to ask. Have any of you left the lounge since the exam started?" All four Jonin shook their heads. Hayate let out a sigh. "That's what I thought," he said. By this time Genma had mastered his amusement and cocked his head, peering at them. It seemed to Kuranai that his attention was focused on her and Guy. "At least the henge were good likenesses," he said after a moment. "Excuse me?" Kuranai asked, narrowing her eyes. Genma looked over at Hayate, who sighed and nodded. "I was assigned to patrolling near the examination building this afternoon," Genma explained. "I caught 3 people on a rooftop trying to signal someone in the examination room. They appeared to be you and Guy-san, along with Amino Aruka, one of the chunin who teach at the academy, but when I confronted them they didn't act quite right." Genma shook his head at that point. "I hit them with some poisoned senbon, but they just exploded. I'm pretty sure now that they were shadow clones. I stopped them, but we're still wondering who did it." Kuranai shook her head. She knew of only one clone user that would pick her, Guy, and Aruka as models. But what the hell was he thinking? Kakashi looked up from his book. "Since the first exam is over now, did Ibiki-san use the prisoner's dilemma, the impossible task, or something even more devious and twisted on our students?" Hayate looked puzzled at the question, but he answered the copy ninja nonetheless. "I believe he went with the second option, with 2 of his confederates seated into the examinees to copy from." At that point, Kakashi's face twisted under his ever-present mask. It wasn't until Kuranai noted the tilt in his visible eye that she realized he was smiling. "You've been had, Genma-san." "What do you mean?" Kuranai asked sharply. "Do Ace Cage Bunshin no Jutsu?" Kakashi asked. Everyone shook their heads. Kakashi shrugged. "It's not surprising. It takes a lot of chakra to summon a clone that will disappear the first time it's hit. More than a few will tap my reserves, so it's only useful in certain situations. One of the reasons it's such a chakra drain is because you are molding enough chakra for it to have a physical presence, without a sustaining material to give it mass, like with Mizu Bunshin. Another reason is because the user is creating a faint impression of his consciousness on the Bunshin, allowing it to think somewhat independently." Kuranai remembered working with Shino on the roof repairs, and carrying on a conversation with one of Naruto's clones, thinking it was the original. "Does the degree of independent thought depend on the amount of chakra used to create the clone?" she asked curiously. It was odd, once you got Kakashi talking about the technical details of an advanced jutsu, how his goofball persona seemed to just fall away for a time. To a degree, Kakashi agreed with a nod. One side effect of the impression process is this. When a clone is dispelled, the knowledge and memories gained by this secondary consciousness will revert to the original. "So what you're saying," Asuma interrupted, crushing out his cigarette, "is the jutsu user will know everything the clone knows." "That's right," Kakashi said. "I remember the night we agreed on the team assignments. Aruka said something about Uzumaki Naruto mastering Cage Bunshin no Jutsu." Kuranai frowned. "Yes, and those were probably his clones. But from the way you described Ibiki's strategy, I believe you called it the impossible task, and his use of confederates, the students were supposed to cheat to pass?" Kakashi shrugged, but Hayate nodded slightly. "It sounds like Naruto had enough time that night to learn a Junin-level technique," Kakashi said with an obvious smirk under his mask, "but not enough time to read all the fine print. Otherwise his clones wouldn't have been trying so hard to signal him, they could have just dispersed themselves to give him whatever information they had collected." "Wait," Genma shouted, the ever-present senbon falling out of the corner of his mouth. "That means when you disrupted his clones, you helped them achieve their mission," Kakashi said lightly. "I'm sure Kuranai-sama appreciates you helping her genin. Maybe you should ask her out on a date?" Kuranai glared at the infamous copy ninja. "Do you really think you have enough traps guarding your literature collection, Kakashi?" Kakashi paled for a moment, but then nodded. "If I hired my team for a C-rank mission to burn them all, it would be money well spent," she replied. "Do you really want to bet all your little orange books against the deviousness of the most notorious prankster to ever graduate from the academy? I must warn you, he's been saving up. He even fooled me once with a genjutsu." Kakashi visibly swallowed and slowly shook his head. Asuma grunted. "You fight dirty," he said approvingly. Kuranai just smiled at him. At this point Genma was banging his head against the wall, while Hayate tried to console him. Guy finished his push-ups, but seemed to still have a lot of nervous energy. He jumped to his feet and began lecturing Kakashi about how he should never try to be cool and hip toward Kuranai-san, a sensei who so obviously understood the power of youth, not noticing that Kakashi had his nose again buried in the book cradled protectively in his hands. All the noise was starting to give Kuranai a headache, so she got up and began walking toward the door. As she reached out to open it, it moved aside on its own. Ibiki stood in the doorway, his face impassive but his dark eyes glittering as she stepped back to allow him entrance. "Is that Uzumaki brat one of yours?" he asked without greeting. Kuranai merely raised an eyebrow. His words betrayed more emotion than he usually allowed to show. Yes, he is. What of it?" "That's what I thought," he said as he handed her the test results. "Got your fingerprints all over him, so to speak. Got one of the highest scores without being observed cheating at all. My assistants are still trying to figure out how he did it." "He had some unwitting assistants," Kuranai replied absently as her eyes flitted down the scoring summary. She smiled slightly. All of her genin had done well, exceptionally well in fact. She looked up at Ibiki, who was visibly glowering. "We just figured it out. You can ask Genma. Now what else happened?" Ibiki sighed. "The last question was a gut check, to see if they could commit in a high-stress situation. I told them that if they chose to answer the last question and failed, they could never take the exam again." Kuranai frowned. That must have gone over well. "Well, it did the job. All the wimps were bailing out like rats leaving a sinking ship, when your genin jumps up on his desk and starts shouting at me," Ibiki continued, scowling. "He tells me I don't have the authority to declare such a rule, and if I did, he'd be the first genin to become Hokage and then he'd fire me." "Fire you?" Kuranai asked, going very still. When Asuma nudged her shoulder, she handed him the exam results, still maintaining iron-rigid self-control. "Yes," Ibiki confirmed sarcastically. "I believe the exact words were, 'I'll fire your ass for making up stupid rules.'" "I see," Kuranai said as she carefully edged toward the doorway. "I'll have a word with him immediately regarding his language," she promised as she slipped out into the hallway. If anyone in the room heard the sound of muffled feminine laughter receding down the hallway, they chose not to say anything about it. To his credit, Naruto actually blushed at Moridaki's that evening when Kuranai questioned him regarding his words toward Morino Ibiki. It was clear he'd been overwrought when he'd confronted the special Jonin, so she eventually let it pass. Overall, she was in far too good a mood to let anything minor spoil it. All three of her genin had tested out near the top of the group, even when counting only those who had passed. Though she would never say so aloud, Hinata and Shino doing well was only to be expected, but Uzumaki Naruto had never seemed to be much for scholastic excellence, or even subtlety. She hoped that Iruka took the opportunity to rub his colleagues' noses in that fact when the scores were released to the academy. Naruto's use of Kage Bunshin had been inspired, even if it did indicate that he wasn't fully aware of how they worked. Not that she refrained from bringing that up when it was his turn to describe his tactics. The rosy blush that returned to his face more than made up for any embarrassment she'd suffered in the Jonin lounge. On the other hand, it was gratifying to note that he'd already mostly figured out that aspect of Kage Bunshin on his own. Moreover, she was cautiously optimistic regarding the confrontation between Naruto and Ibiki. Of course, the Jonin had been irked at how, publicly, Naruto had called his bluff. But at worst, he'd only have to deal with some kidding from the other instructors. Out of anyone in Konoha, she was sure the head of the Anbu torture and interrogation squad could appreciate what had been done to Naruto, and respect the boy for not turning into a murderous beast. Even his comments earlier that day had been laced with grudging respect. Hopefully when the time came, he would regard defending Naruto from a faceless conspiracy to be in the best interests of Konohagakure. As they finished their meal, Kuranai also couldn't help but notice that Hinata had been even more quiet than usual. The pale-eyed girl described her surreptitious use of the Byakugan in as few words as possible, looking down the whole time. She even looked uncomfortable when Naruto praised her for being extra sneaky. After giving her students directions on how to reach the second examination, using a map of the Konoha training areas, Kuranai suggested that they go hear equipment and get as much rest as possible. But after she paid the bill, she followed her students out. "Hinata, would you stay a moment?" she asked the Hyuga girl in a voice that was little more than a whisper. The girl nodded. As soon as Naruto and Shino were out of sight, Kuranai spoke again. "Now what's bothering you?" The young Kunoichi looked even more uncomfortable, if that was possible. "Anyo, Kuranai-sensei. I am just disappointed in myself," she said quietly. Kuranai refrained from comment as she gestured for Hinata to follow her. After they both sat down on a bench not too far from Moritaki's entryway, she took a deep breath. Hyuga Hiyashi's treatment of his daughter was atrocious, and every time she had to deal with the consequences, it became harder and harder to restrain her anger. "Please explain to me why you were disappointed, Hinata," She asked in as gentle a voice as she could manage. "I have heard nothing tonight that you should not be proud of." "I'm sorry, sensei," Hinata said in a miserable tone. "It was wrong of me to conceal my failures. But I didn't want the others to know." Her voice trailed off. "To know how close I came to making us all fail," she added rapidly, the words practically tripping over each other. Kuranai frowned, trying to make sense of the girl's words. During the 10th question, she choked out. "I almost raised my hand. I couldn't bear the thought of Naruto being limited to genin for the rest of his life. I know he isn't stupid, but I thought maybe they'd introduced that rule because he was taking the test this year. So many people are cruel to him. I couldn't bear the thought of, but I should have believed in him." Hinata's shoulders hitched as her words became fragmentary. There were few people on the street in the early evening to witness the Hyuga heir having a public breakdown, but nonetheless Kuranai quickly cast a simple genjutsu to conceal their identities. The last thing she wanted was word of this to reach the girl's father. Then she stiffly leaned over and wrapped her arm around her student's thin shoulders. Hinata went utterly still for a moment, and Kuranai worried that she'd misread the girl's psychological state. She was about to lift her arm when Hinata turned and wrapped her arms around Kuranai with surprising strength. The girl was shaking like a leaf, but Maida Guy's weight training program had very noticeable results. Kuranai swallowed the lump that tried to form in her throat. She'd long ago discarded any plans of settling down and raising a family, but moments like this made her question the decision. For other reasons, Hinata's reaction made her scowl. She wondered how long had it been since anyone had comforted her in such a manner. Since her mother passed away? When Hinata's trembling began to ebb and her breathing returned to normal, Kuranai finally spoke up. "Hinata, I don't see where you did anything wrong. You were concerned for your teammate, and were looking out for his best interests. When it was clear that he correctly assessed the risks and chose to continue, you went along with that. You have nothing to apologize for, either to me or to your teammates." Hinata let go of her sensei in order to look up and at her in confusion. Kuranai ignored the odd pang she felt as she let go as well. "But I would have made us fail," Hinata protested in a small voice. "But you didn't," Kuranai reminded her. Hinata slowly shook her head. "Only because Naruto-kun stopped me," she protested. "It was foolish of me to think people would go to all this trouble to make Naruto fail," she continued. Kuranai froze in place for a moment as she weighed the risks. It was only an instant, so she was mildly surprised when Hinata looked up at her. "Sensei?" the genin asked in a worried voice. "Hinata," Kuranai said, choosing her words carefully. "There is something you should know, but you are under no circumstances to discuss this with anyone besides myself. Do I make myself clear?" Hinata nodded, eyes even wider than normal. Kuranai glanced around. No one was nearby, but she quickly performed another genjutsu that would mask their words from any curious ears. "Your suspicions are not completely unfounded," she told her student after a moment. "Between Shino, Iruka-sensei, and myself, we have uncovered signs that some people are acting in ways to hurt Naruto and prevent him from being accepted in the village. I don't think they would be able to change the Chunin examination rules to accomplish this, but I am cautious about everything where Naruto is concerned." Hinata's next words caught Kuranai completely off balance. "Is my father involved?" she asked, tension visible in the trembling of her jaw. "I don't know," was all Kuranai could say. She hadn't anticipated Hinata making that connection so fast. The head of the Hyuga clan would have the influence to do some of the things we've uncovered, but that alone is not proof. Hinata's eyes had gone very still, and seemed to bore into Kuranai's as she spoke. "He asked me, after we returned from the border, about the fight with the kidnappers," Hinata said. Kuranai's breath seemed to catch in her throat. If he knew that Naruto had drawn on the Kyuubi's chakra, he could use that too. However, Hinata continued, "I was unconscious for some of the battle and could not answer his questions." He seemed very disappointed. Now Kuranai finally recognized why Hinata's eyes seemed to have unnerved her for an instant. Her student was angry. "Your discretion is highly appreciated, Hinata," she said evenly as she remembered a discussion between her own parents that she'd overheard a year before she graduated from the academy. They'd just returned from the funeral of one of her father's trading partners, one Hiroto Yasuri. He and his daughter Natsuki both died after eating a meal prepared with some wild mushrooms that turned out to have been highly poisonous. It was ruled to be an accident, but Kuranai's parents didn't believe it. The daughter had been 39 at the time, an unusual age for a once attractive girl to remain unwed. It wasn't, however, for a lack of suitors. Her father had rejected the young men of the village who'd asked permission to court his daughter, hoping she would catch the eye of one of the nobility. He was extremely wealthy, but money couldn't buy entry into the nobility of Fire Country, so his only option was through marriage. Unfortunately, his insistence that his daughter could only marry someone of that class had left her alone until her youth had fled. While many who knew the family felt bad about the situation, Natsuki never complained and never spoke about it, but she'd prepared the meal that claimed her and her father's life. Kuranai blinked, as she wondered what had stirred up that memory. As a shinobi of the leaf, Hinata was not quite as constrained as Hiroto Natsuki had been. Perhaps it was the reminder that a meek and soft-spoken exterior could conceal surprising depths. It was a lesson she was sure that Hyuga Hiyashi had yet to learn. Naruto made sure he arrived at training area 44 at least an hour before the second exam was scheduled to begin. As it was, Shino was already there, and Hinata arrived at roughly the same time. After all the nervous tension of the first exam, and then unwinding at the celebratory dinner at Moritaki's, he'd fallen asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. Now, after sleeping far later than he was used to, he felt ready to take on the world. Which was a good thing, given how some of the other examinees were eyeing him as they arrived at what signs announced was a forbidden area. Shino was quiet as he paced back and forth, facing the fence that marked the boundaries of the training area. Naruto had never seen his friend, fidget like that before. He supposed that the seriousness of the situation was finally getting to the normally unflappable Aburame. Serious or not, he doubted Shino would appreciate him commenting on his behavior, so Naruto stood next to Hinata and went through his mental check he'd packed. The instructions relayed from Kurenai-sensei said to come prepared as they usually would be for a mission. Given that some of their missions were weeks long, that could mean a lot. Also, when he looked at Sensei's map of the training areas, Area 44, located at the northwest edge of the village and extending well out into fire country, was a circle 20 kilometers in diameter. That suggested that the second exam might last far longer than the first. So he, and to a lesser extent Hinata, had packed heavily for this mission. The chakra-enhanced training weights on their wrists and ankles could always be adjusted to make up the extra weight. While doing this slightly changed their balance, they had adjusted by the time they reached the training area. Hinata left the normal bag she carried around Konoha at home, and instead wore a full-sized backpack over her jacket. Naruto's pack was slightly oversized for his height, but was strapped on tightly and didn't interfere with his movements. He'd even tested this by wearing it during a sparring match with Lee the day after he'd purchased it from Tenten's father. The fabric directly over his back concealed a thin layer of metal links between it and the lining. It might not stop a kunai, but it could slow one down. He also wore both kunai holsters and equipment pouches today. Some of the other genin looked at him curiously as they arrived, but others looked thoughtful or worried. He wondered briefly if they thought he had some inside information about the next stage, but it wasn't like they couldn't make the same deductions his team had. He scowled for a moment. He was starting to sound like Shikamaru. Next thing he knew he'd be lying on his back, staring up at the sky and calling his teammates troublesome. He glanced over at Hinata. Truth be told, if he'd been stuck with Ino, it would have been troublesome. There was no doubt in his mind regarding which kunoichi he'd rather have backing him up. His mind wandered back to his former crush on Sakura, and he was surprised that his lingering anger and disappointment were gone. Perhaps talking with Lee had helped himself as well. "Hey Hinata?" he asked quietly. Hinata jumped a little, but quickly turned toward him. "Do you think we might have forgotten anything?" he asked. Hinata shook her head. "I went over my list 3 times last night before I went to bed. I checked it again this morning." Naruto nodded. "I checked too, but I think I might have forgotten something." Hinata shook her head again. "I don't think you'd." He smiled at her. "When I get excited, I sometimes forget the little things. You're more, what did Kurenai-sensei call it, detail-oriented?" Hinata blushed and looked down. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just get worried about forgetting something, so I tend to go over things compulsively." Naruto frowned at her. "I think it's a good thing that you do. We'd probably screw up a lot more if you weren't looking out for us." "Shino-kun is very careful with," she objected, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Okay," Naruto capitulated with a grin. "I would probably screw up a lot more if you weren't looking out for me." This time an unmistakable blush spread over her face, giving Naruto an odd sense of satisfaction. He'd been giving this a lot of thought. Kurenai-sensei wouldn't say exactly what was going on with Hinata, but she'd hinted a lot. Remembering how he'd felt when Kurenai complimented him on something, acknowledging that he'd done something praiseworthy, he'd started to understand why Hinata seemed so flustered and embarrassed when he tried to compliment her. The problem was, he could understand why he was so unused to praise. But what reasons could there be for Hyuga Hinata, heir and member of main family of one of the most prestigious clans in Konoha? That wasn't something he'd figured out yet, and sometimes he wondered if he really wanted to know. But in the meantime, he could build these elaborate traps out of words, maneuvering Hinata-chan into accepting his words at face value. It was odd, of course, how she seemed to want to believe him, but still couldn't, of course. That just added to the challenge, didn't it? And Uzumaki Naruto lived for challenges. "Hinata," he said suddenly, "could you use your eyes to check me out?" His teammate froze, her face turning even redder. "And Naruto?" she choked out after a moment. "I mean, with your Byakugan, you can see inside my backpack and see if I forgot anything," he explained. "I don't want to open it up and dump it out here in front of everyone," he continued. "I don't want anyone to see all the stuff I have packed." Oh, Hinata said after a moment, as her face began to return to normal. "That makes sense, I suppose." Her fingers quickly formed the seal for her bloodline ability. "Byakugan," she murmured. A hint of red remained on her cheeks as she circled around Naruto. "I can't see anything you missed," she said quickly, as her attention drifted down to his weapon pouches and kunai holsters for a moment. She quickly spun away and her eyes went back to normal. Oddly, her cheeks were flaming again. "You seem to have plenty of shuriken and kunai," she said quietly, facing away from him, "though you only packed 1 box of ration bars in your backpack. What if this takes more than a week?" "That's still in there?" Naruto asked in surprise. "I thought I decided to throw it away. I figured I can always eat some tree bark if I get hungry and can't find anything else. It would taste better." Maybe that would remind her of how much better her cooking tasted. Hinata stifled a giggle at his comment. Unfortunately, her self-restraint wasn't perfect, as an extremely unladylike snort escaped from her nose. She froze, mortified, as Naruto burst out laughing. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but Uzumaki Naruto couldn't help it. It wasn't unheard of for someone to make an odd noise when muffling laughter, but to hear it come from his refined teammate was just priceless. The horrified look on her face just made it even funnier. It was a few moments before he could even stand up straight again. "Arigato, Hinata-san," he said, bowing deeply before his embarrassed teammate. "Naruto?" she asked, her curiosity seeming to override her embarrassment for the moment. He gave her his widest smile. "Here I am, getting nervous about the exam, and wondering if I forgot something, and then you do something like that to distract me. You rock, Hinata." Hinata's face paled dramatically, then gradually returned to normal, albeit with a slight pinkish cast to it. Naruto felt inordinately pleased. He'd done something right, even if he wasn't sure what it was. Shino finished his nervous pacing before too many of the other examinees arrived and stood next to them. Given some of the hateful looks they'd been given the previous day, Naruto preferred that they all stand together when around strangers. That wasn't even taking into account what they knew about Sabaku no Gara. Of course, this Mitarashi Anko wasn't exactly increasing his sense of security. He didn't even notice her arriving, which was unnerving enough. Her words didn't help either. "This is where the second exam will take place. The 44th training area, also known as the Forest of Death," she explained in a casual, yet creepy voice. Some of the candidates murmured at that. "You will soon be able to experience why this place is called the Forest of Death," she continued happily. "But before we begin the second exam, I'm going to pass these out to everyone." With that, she pulled a thick stack of official-looking forms out of her trench coat. "These are consent forms. Those taking the exam must sign these." "Why?" several examinees asked. "From here on, people will die," she replied in a casual tone. "Therefore we need people's consent before we continue. Otherwise, I'd be held accountable." She ended with chuckle, but no one else seemed to find her words funny. "Now, I will begin to explain the second exam," she continued after a moment. "To be brief, this is Gun." She handed the stack of forms to Hinata, who took one and handed the stack to Naruto, who took a pair for himself and Shino before handing the rest to Shikamaru. "This area," she explained as she unrolled a map she'd pulled out of her trench coat, "is a circular region surrounded by 44 locked gates. In addition to rivers and forests, there is a tower in the middle. It's around 10 kilometers from any entrance to the tower. Inside this area you will have to fend for yourselves as you battle over these scrolls," she explained, pulling 2 sealed scrolls from inside her trench coat as she replaced the map. Naruto wondered briefly if there was a jutsu that allowed her to carry so much stuff in it. The light-colored scroll displayed the kanji for heaven, while the darker-colored one displayed the symbol for earth. 28 teams passed the first exam, Anko explained. Half of those teams will get the heaven scroll. The other half will get the earth scroll. Each team gets 1 scroll. "What is needed to pass?" Sasuke asked in a serious tone, making several people look around. "Bring the scrolls of heaven and earth to the tower with your teammates," Anko answered. "In other words, 14 teams, half the people here, will get their scroll stolen and therefore fail," Sakura said thoughtfully. "It also needs to be done within the time limit," Anko added. "This second exam has a time limit of 120 hours, or exactly 5 days. 5 days? Ino asked, incredulous. "What about food?" Choji asked, horrified. "Scrounge it up yourself," Anko said in a dismissive tone. "This forest is a treasure box of nature. There should be plenty of food." Naruto had a feeling that Team 10 hadn't taken a look at a map, or realized the implications of the training area size until now. However, Kabuto added helpfully, "There are a lot of man-eating beasts, poison bugs, and poisonous plants." "Oh no," Choji murmured as Ino scolded him. "This test seems quite difficult," Lee said with a grin that made his teeth gleam. Neji gave him a dirty look while Tenten sighed. "And we're surrounded by enemies," Sasuke added thoughtfully. "We won't be able to sleep in peace. People will get hurt in the process of fighting over the scrolls," Anko said, "and those who cannot deal with the difficulties will be revealed." "So can we forfeit if that happens?" Shikamaru asked. "As a rule, you are not allowed to give up during the exam," Anko announced. "You will spend the full 5 days in the forest." "Just as I thought," Shikamaru said with noticeable disgust in his voice. How troublesome. While we're on this topic, Anko continued, ignoring the Nara boy. Here are the conditions that will fail you. First, if you do not arrive at the tower with 3 teammates and both scrolls, you fail. Second, if your team loses a member, you automatically fail. Finally, you are not allowed to look inside the scrolls until you reach the tower. What happens if we do? Naruto asked curiously. Then you will get a surprise, Anko promised with a nasty smile. If you become a chunin, you will be handling top secret doents. It's a test of your reliability. That's it for the explanations. We will exchange 3 signed consent forms for 1 scroll over in that hut. Naruto's eyes looked where she was pointing, and saw it was manned by several chunin proctors, some of which he recognized from the previous day. After you are assigned a gate entrance, Anko continued, everyone will begin at the same time. She sighed gustily. Here's a last piece of advice, don't die. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he clenched his fists. Ooh. It took a few minutes for the chunin proctors to set up a curtain around the hut where the forms were to be turned in. This gave them plenty of time to fill them out, with a little left over for Ino and Sakura to snub each other. Naruto stretched to get some of the tension out of his shoulders, and saw Lee doing some warm-ups. The 2 boys exchanged a nod. While their teams had a 50-50 chance of competing directly against each other, depending on how the scrolls were distributed, they wouldn't forget Gai-sensei's words either. The shinobi of the leaf would stick together if the situation got out of hand and there was a chance of permanent harm. When it was their turn, Team 8 moved silently behind the curtain. When the chunin held out a heaven scroll, both Hinata and Shino gestured toward Naruto. Naruto shrugged and silently removed his backpack, shoving the scroll all the way to the bottom before closing it and putting it back on. He was touched that his teammates wished to trust him with carrying their team's scroll, and vowed not to let them down. After all of the teams were done, Anko sent each team off with a chunin to guide them to their assigned gates. It wasn't long until they arrived at gate 16 and waited for the chunin guide to allow them inside. After consulting his chronometer, he unlocked the padlock and stepped aside. In a flash, the 3 of them were through the gate, moving into the forest at high speed. The first chakra-assisted leap got them up into the canopy, so they stopped leaving tracks on the ground. Hinata was between the 2 boys, and slightly in front, allowing for the best possible coverage with her all-seeing eyes. Shino signaled danger ahead and to the right, so they smoothly veered to the left. At Hinata's signal, they came to a sudden halt on a thick bough that easily supported their combined weight. No one is in range of my eyes, Hinata whispered. Good, Naruto grunted. Shino, what was that back there? I saw signs of a large colony of konoha forest leeches, the Aburame answered. I assumed you wanted to avoid them. He paused. I don't sense any of the other teams near us, he reported. Naruto frowned. How? I arrived early and seeded the grass in the meeting area with female kikai bugs, Shino explained. I believe that 1 or more members of every team have 1 writing on them now. And as you know, other members of my colonies can smell them from a mile away, Naruto finished, grinning. Shino, you sneaky bastard. He congratulated his teammate. As a reconnaissance team, it would be foolish not to play to our strengths, Shino said as he readjusted his dark glasses.